The banker's fist hit the desk so hard the inkwell rattled. "Get out!" 2 words. That was all Harold Briggs gave her. Harold Briggs, who had eaten at her table 3 Christmases in a row, who had shaken her husband's hand at every cattle auction for 15 years, who had bounced her youngest on his knee and called her the finest woman in Red Valley. 2 words, and he wouldn't even look at her when he said them. Evelyn Ward stood in the middle of the cattleman's bank with her hat in her hands and 6 children waiting outside in the cold, and she did not cry. She wanted to. She felt the tears pushing up behind her eyes like floodwater behind a dam. But she did not cry because Harold Briggs was already looking past her at the door, and she understood with the particular clarity that comes from being humiliated in a room full of witnesses that he had decided she was already gone. "Mr. Briggs," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later. "I'm asking for 60 days. Not a gift. A loan, with the ranch as collateral. My husband's land is worth 4 times what I'm asking for." "Your husband's land," Briggs said. And now he did look at her, and what was in his eyes was worse than contempt. It was amusement, is worth nothing without a man to work it. The clerk at the side desk made a small sound. It might have been a cough. It might have been a laugh. Evelyn put her hat back on her head, turned around, and walked out. She would not give Harold Briggs the satisfaction of watching her hands shake. If you've ever been told you were too much, too loud, too big, too broken, too far gone to matter, then stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when a woman who has been counted out by everyone refuses to count herself out. Before we go further, if stories like this speak to something in you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every name in that comment section is a reminder that we're never as alone as the world tries to make us feel. Now let's go back to Red Valley, Montana, and to the woman nobody believed in. Well, the morning Evelyn Ward became a widow, the sky was the color of a bruise. It had been that kind of October, gray pressing down on gray, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself but simply arrived one day and stayed, settling into the walls of the house and the joints of your hands and the space between your shoulder blades where you couldn't reach to warm it. Thomas Ward had gone out before dawn to check the fence line on the north pasture, the way he did every morning of their married life, and he had not come back. The doctor said it was his heart. Evelyn had looked at the man on the bed, at Thomas's broad, weathered face, still wearing that expression of mild concentration he always had when he was thinking something through. And she had thought, without fully understanding why she thought it, he didn't get to finish the thought. That was grief, she would learn. It didn't come in the shape you expected. She had 6 children to feed. The oldest, James, was 14 and already broad in the shoulder, already carrying that Ward stubbornness in the set of his jaw. The youngest, Clara, was 4 years old and still sometimes called out for her father in the night, and then fell back to sleep before Evelyn could get to her room. Between them were Daniel, who was 12, and Ruth, who was 10, and the twins, Samuel and Eliza, who had just turned 7 and still had not fully grasped that their father was not coming back from wherever he had gone. The ranch had been Thomas's dream, built on 20 years of work and a talent for cattle that Evelyn had always admired but never pretended to fully share. She knew how to keep the books. She knew how to manage the household with the precision of a general managing a supply line. She knew, with the particular competence of a woman who has spent 2 decades paying attention, the price of feed at 3 different suppliers, and the name of every man who owed Thomas a favor. What she discovered in the weeks after the funeral was that none of that knowledge protected her from what came next. The debts were worse than Thomas had let on. She found the ledger on a Tuesday afternoon, buried under 3 years of receipts in the bottom drawer of his desk, and she sat on the floor of his study for a long time reading it without moving. Thomas had borrowed against the ranch twice, once after the drought of 1881 dried up the summer yield, and once to buy the additional pasture land on the east side that he'd always said would double their herd capacity by 1885. Both loans were with the Cattlemen's Bank. Both were due in full by the 1st of December. She did the arithmetic 4 times, hoping she had made an error. She had not. She pulled herself up off the floor, smoothed her skirt, and went to make supper for 6 children who were depending on her not to fall apart. The trip to the bank had been James's idea, which meant it was really Evelyn's idea. The way most good plans in their household began as her idea and got attributed to whoever said them out loud first. James had said, at breakfast 2 weeks after she found the ledger, "You should go talk to Mr. Briggs, Mama. Tell him what happened. He knew Papa." He knew Papa. That was the thing. That was the thing Evelyn had told herself on the ride into town, her good wool coat buttoned to the chin against the November cold, her hands steady on the reins. Harold Briggs knew Thomas Ward for 15 years. He will listen. He is a reasonable man. She had been wrong about Harold Briggs. She had also, she would come to understand, been wrong about several other people she had trusted. Margaret Holloway was the wife of the largest landowner in the valley, a woman Evelyn had considered a close friend since the year they both arrived in Red Valley as young brides within a month of each other. They had helped each other through difficult winters, difficult pregnancies, difficult men. Evelyn had held Margaret's hand through a miscarriage that Margaret had never told her husband about. She went to Margaret after the bank. She went because she was running out of options and because she genuinely believed, that friendship meant something. Margaret answered the door herself, which was unusual. She looked at Evelyn standing on the porch, and something crossed her face that Evelyn did not want to name. "Evie," she said, "I need to talk to you." Margaret stepped back from the door but did not open it further. She did not invite Evelyn inside. She stood in the gap with one hand on the doorframe and said, "I heard about the bank." Small towns had their own kind of telegraph. Evelyn had known that for years. "Word travels fast," Evelyn said. "People talk." Margaret's voice had gone careful and flat. "Evie, I want you to know I feel terrible about this. I truly do. But George has already said we can't get involved. The bank situation, the debts, if we're associated with that kind of—" She stopped, started again. "You understand." Evelyn looked at her friend. She looked at the woman who knew every difficult and private thing about her life for 2 decades, who had sat across from her at more kitchen tables than she could count, who had accepted her help when accepting help meant swallowing pride and asking for it. "I understand," Evelyn said. She understood very clearly. She went to 3 other families that week. The result was the same in each house. Varying degrees of politeness wrapped around the same core message, which was that Evelyn Ward had become a problem, and problems were contagious. What she heard, repeated in different variations by different voices, told her something she had already suspected but had not wanted to hold directly in her mind. They were not primarily afraid of her debt. They were afraid of what she looked like. She was a big woman, had been her whole life, built solidly, the way some women are built, tall and broad-shouldered, and she had never had the kind of figure that the women in Harper's Bazaar illustrations seemed to suggest was the only acceptable shape for a person to exist in. She had never thought much about it, truthfully, because Thomas had never thought much about it, and because she had always been too busy living to spend a great deal of time worrying about the geometry of her body. She thought about it now. She could hear it in the way Margaret had said a woman like her without quite saying it. She could hear it in the way Harold Briggs had looked at her, not at her face, not at her, but at the outline of her, as though the outline had already told him everything he needed to know, and the actual conversation was a formality he was tolerating. A woman like her. Too much, too large, too many children, too poor, too everything that made people uncomfortable, and not enough of anything they valued. On the 2nd of December, with the loan deadline passed and the bank's letter sitting on the kitchen table, Evelyn sat at that same table while her children slept and made a list of what she had. It was a habit she'd developed early in the marriage, in the lean years before Thomas's cattle business found its footing. When things were bad, she made lists, because lists meant she was still thinking, and thinking meant she hadn't given up. What she had: 2 trunks of household goods, a wagon, and a pair of horses, neither young, but both sound. $40 in cash, hidden in the lining of her winter coat for an emergency she had hoped would never come. 6 children, ranging from 7 to 14, all healthy, all stubborn, all carrying the Ward gene for refusing to lie down when things got hard. What she did not have: a roof, a plan, a single person in Red Valley who was willing to stand beside her. She looked at the list for a long time. Then she made supper, woke the children gently, and told them they were leaving in the morning. James nodded, the way he nodded when he was scared and was deciding to be brave instead. Daniel asked where they were going. Ruth, who was 10 and had already developed the quiet, observational intelligence that would serve her all her life, said nothing and watched her mother's face. "I don't know yet," Evelyn told them. She did not believe in lying to her children about hard things. "But I know we're not staying." The twins held hands under the table. Clara, who was 4 and didn't understand most of what was happening, asked if she could bring her doll. "Of course you can," Evelyn said. "We're bringing everything that matters." They were packed and loaded by dawn. The wagon sat in front of the house they had lived in for 12 years, and Evelyn allowed herself 60 seconds to look at it. The house Thomas had built with his own hands, the porch he'd added the second winter because she'd mentioned once that she liked watching the sunsets from outside, the window boxes on the front that were empty now in November, but in spring filled up with whatever wildflowers the children picked on their way home from school. 60 seconds. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat and clicked the horses forward. She did not look back. It cost her something not to, but she managed it. They had been on the main road through town for perhaps 10 minutes when the riders appeared. There were 4 of them, and they positioned themselves across the road with the particular casualness of men who are used to getting what they want without having to ask for it directly. At the front was Dale Mercer, not a man Evelyn had ever liked, but one she had always managed to be civil to, because Dale Mercer owned the grain supply, and incivility had consequences when you needed to buy grain. He was grinning now, which told her everything she needed to know about the nature of this encounter. "Evelyn," he said, not even giving her the misses. "Heard you were pulling out." "You heard correctly." She kept the reins loose in her hands. She did not want the horses to feel her tension. "Where you headed?" "That's my own business." "Well," Mercer rolled the toothpick he was perpetually chewing from one side of his mouth to the other. "I only asked because Harold wanted me to let you know. The furniture in the house and the tools in the barn, those belong to the bank now. You were supposed to leave them." She had. She knew the terms of the foreclosure. She had not touched a single piece of furniture. She had taken only the family's personal belongings, clothing, her mother's quilts, the children's books, Thomas's watch, which was the one thing she could not bring herself to leave because James sometimes held it when he was frightened and didn't want anyone to see. "I left the furniture," she said. "Harold says you took the sewing machine." The sewing machine had been a wedding gift from her own mother. It did not belong to the ranch and had never been listed in the ranch's assets. She had brought it because it was hers, and also because she could use it to earn money if she had to, and she had not felt that she needed to explain any of this to Harold Briggs. "The sewing machine was mine before I married," she said. "It was never ranch property." Mercer shrugged. "Harold says different." James had straightened beside her on the wagon seat. He was 14 and already close to her height, and he had the Ward stubbornness in full flower this morning, his jaw hard and his eyes gone very still. Evelyn put her hand on his arm once, briefly, without looking at him. She felt him register it and go still. She looked at Dale Mercer. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the particular helplessness of being a woman alone on a road with 6 children and 2 horses and $40, facing 4 men who knew exactly how helpless she was, and had arranged themselves across this road to make sure she understood it too. She reached under the seat and took out the folded document that she had put there that morning when she loaded the wagon, because she had packed the wagon the night before, and she had thought about this conversation, or something like it, and she had prepared for it. "This," she said, holding it out so that Mercer could see it clearly without being able to take it, "is my mother's bill of sale for the sewing machine, dated 1864. My name is on it. The machine is mine." She folded it back up, put it away. "Tell Harold I said good morning." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Mercer's toothpick moved to the other side of his mouth. He looked at her with an expression that had shifted from amusement to something that was not quite respect, but was at least a cousin to it. He moved his horse off the road. The other 3 moved with him. Evelyn clicked her tongue, and the horses walked forward. She kept her back straight and her eyes ahead, and she did not let her hands shake until they were around the bend and out of sight, and by then the trembling had moved up from her hands to somewhere in the center of her chest where it stayed for a long time, Not quite grief, not quite fear, but something that lived between them. The road out of Red Valley was long and mostly empty. The children were quiet for a while, which was unusual, and she let the quiet sit. After about an hour, Clara fell asleep against Ruth's shoulder. Daniel, who processed things by asking questions, said, "Mama, where are we actually going?" "I heard there was work in Millbrook," Evelyn said. Millbrook was 40 miles east. She had no more information about it than that. She had heard a man at the feed store mention it 2 weeks ago, which was the entirety of her research. "Is that true?" Daniel asked, because Daniel was 12 and had already started to notice when adults were making things up. "Partly," Evelyn said. That produced a silence that lasted another half-mile. "I'm hungry," Samuel said. "You were hungry an hour ago," Eliza told him, with the tolerance of a twin who has long since stopped being surprised by the other's limitations. "I'm still hungry." Evelyn reached behind the seat without looking and produced a biscuit from the cloth bag she'd packed that morning, handing it back. There were 7 biscuits in the bag. She had counted them. She would not be eating one. It was James who said, eventually, in a voice that was trying very hard to be a man's voice and mostly succeeding, "We're going to be all right, aren't we?" It was not quite a question. Evelyn looked at the road ahead, at the frost still on the grass on either side of it, at the sky, which had gone from gray to the particular pale gold of a winter morning trying its best. "Yes," she said. She meant it. She was not entirely sure she believed it yet, but she meant it, and with the Ward stubbornness that she had not realized she possessed until Thomas died and left her no choice but to find it. That was enough to start with. What she did not know, on that cold November morning, was that less than 3 miles up the road, a man on horseback was about to round a bend and change the direction of everything. She did not know his name yet. She did not know anything about him except that he was coming, the way certain things come, not in spite of the worst moments but directly because of them, as though the road has to get narrow enough before it can open up again. She kept driving. The horses kept moving, and somewhere ahead of her through the frost and the pale gold morning, something she had not planned for was already on its way. He came around the bend at a pace that suggested he was not in a hurry, but also not a man who wasted time, a distinction Evelyn noted without quite knowing why she noted it. He was on a gray horse, big and well kept, the kind of animal that told you something about its owner before the owner opened his mouth. The man himself was somewhere past 40, lean in the way that comes from decades of outdoor work rather than from any particular effort at it, with a face that had been weathered into something angular and still. He wore his hat low and his coat was good wool, the practical kind, not the showy kind. He was not looking at her when he came around the bend. He was looking at the road ahead, the way men do when they have ridden the same stretch of country enough times that they are not really seeing it anymore. Then he saw the wagon. He slowed his horse without making a production of it. He took in the wagon, the 2 trunks roped to the back, the 6 children arranged in the bed like a set of Russian dolls decreasing in size toward the rear, the woman on the seat who was holding the reins with a steadiness that did not quite match the tightness around her eyes. He pulled up alongside her at a respectful distance and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said, and kept moving because she was not stopping for anyone today unless she had to. He fell into pace beside her, which she had not expected. "You're heading east," he said. "I am. Road forks about 2 miles up. Left branch washes out every winter about this time. Happened 3 days ago. You'd lose a wheel before you made it a quarter mile." She looked at him then. He was looking at the road ahead, not at her, which she found, and she could not have explained why, unexpectedly decent of him. "Right branch takes you around," he said. "Adds maybe 4 miles, but you'll keep the wagon." She considered this. She had not known about the fork or about the washed-out road. She had not been down this way in over a year. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, started to pull ahead. Then, and she did not know what made her say it, perhaps the biscuits, perhaps the $40, perhaps Dale Mercer's toothpick. She said, "Do you know anything about work in Millbrook?" He stopped his horse, turned and looked at her properly for the first time. She waited to see what would be in his expression, pity or amusement or that particular blankness that meant a man had already decided she wasn't worth the trouble of a real answer. She had seen all three in the past 3 weeks. What she saw instead was something that took her a moment to identify because she had not seen it in a while. He was thinking about the question. Actually thinking, the way people do when they intend to give you a real answer instead of a polite one. Not much, he said. Town's been slow since the mill closed last spring. You'd be competing for work with about 50 men who've been there longer. He paused. Where are you coming from? Red Valley. Something moved through his expression. Not pity. Recognition, maybe, though of what she couldn't say. Ward Ranch, he said. She straightened slightly. How do you know that? Thomas Ward. I bought cattle from him twice. Good stock. He paused again. I heard he passed. October. He looked at the road, looked at the children, looked at the 2 trunks. He did not say he was sorry, which she found, again, and she was surprised to find it, the right instinct. The words, I'm sorry, had started to feel like a door being closed, like a way of finishing a conversation that the other person wanted done. I have a ranch, he said, 12 miles north of here, Gideon Cross. He said his name the way some people state a fact, not proudly, just accurately. Evelyn Ward, she said. I know. He glanced at her, and there was something almost dry in it. Small territory. What kind of ranch? Cattle, mostly. Some horses. 3 permanent hands, 2 seasonal. House needs work. The woman who used to manage the household left last spring to go back east, and I've been doing it badly since. He said this last part without apparent embarrassment. I'm not looking for charity cases. The words landed flat and honest. She found she preferred them to everything Harold Briggs had said with his careful, smiling face. Neither am I, she said. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. I'm offering work, real work, with pay, room and board included for you and the children. Your oldest boy looks like he can sit a horse. The others, I'll find something useful for them, nothing dangerous. James, who had been listening to this entire conversation with the rigid stillness of someone pretending to look at the middle distance, said, I can sit a horse. Gideon Cross looked at him. Looked at him the way you look at something you are actually assessing, not the performative adult-to-child glance that most men gave 14-year-olds. How well, he said. Well enough, James said. The corner of Cross's mouth moved. Might have been the beginning of something. That's about right, he said. He looked back at Evelyn. I'm not a man who asks twice. You want to think it over, I understand that, but the offer is what it is. And I need someone who can actually run a household and keep the books, not someone I have to teach from the ground up. She looked at him. She looked at the road ahead, at the fork she now knew was coming, at the 2 horses who were starting to shift in place from standing still in the cold. She thought about $40. She thought about Millbrook and 50 men who'd been there longer. She thought about the particular arithmetic of a woman alone with 6 children and no roof, and a Montana winter 12 days from settling in for good. She thought about what James had said that morning. We're going to be all right, aren't we? I'll see the ranch first, she said, before I decide. Cross nodded. Fair enough. He turned his horse north. Forks up ahead. Stay right. He did not wait for her. He started north at that same unhurried, efficient pace, and after a moment she clicked the horses into motion and followed him, not because she trusted him, she didn't know him well enough to trust him, but because $40 and a hunch were about as much as she had to navigate by, and the hunch said that a man who warned you about a washed-out road when he had nothing to gain from it was at least a man who might be worth knowing. The ranch appeared after 12 miles of road that was better kept than she'd expected, which told her something. A man who maintains his roads in November is a man who thinks about what comes next. The property itself spread wide on both sides of the approach. Pasture that had been properly managed, fencing that was in good repair except for one section on the west side that had been recently damaged and not yet fixed, which told her he was not pretending to perfection. The cattle she could see from the road were in reasonable condition. The horses in the near pasture were better than reasonable. The house itself was large and sound and needed work in the particular way of a house that had been maintained against collapse, but not maintained with any love. The porch railing was loose on the left side. The kitchen garden had gone to hard frost and weeds. 2 windows on the south face needed their glazing replaced before the worst cold hit. She noticed all of this in the time it took to drive from the gate to the front of the house, because she could not look at a house without doing this, any more than she could look at a ledger without immediately seeing where the numbers didn't line up. 3 men came out of the barn as they pulled up. They ranged from young to middle-aged, and they all had the particular look of men who work outdoors in cold climates, compact, watchful, economical with their movement. They looked at the wagon. They looked at the 6 children beginning to climb down from the back. They looked at Evelyn. She looked back. "Mrs. Ward," Gideon said, without ceremony. "That's Pete Calloway. He runs the cattle operation. Walt Drummond, horses. And Billy Reck, who does everything else." He paused. "She's looking at the place, possibly taking over the household." None of the 3 said anything overtly, but the young one, Billy Reck, and the middle-aged one, Pete Calloway, exchanged a glance she caught perfectly well. It was not a hostile glance. It was the glance of 2 men adjusting to unexpected information, which was at least preferable to hostility. Walt Drummond, who was somewhere between 40 and 60 and had a face like a map of everywhere he'd been, looked at Evelyn steadily and said, "You know horses?" "I know how to manage a household budget that includes horses," she said, "if that's what you're asking." He almost smiled. "Close enough." She toured the house with Gideon Cross walking slightly ahead, not hovering, pointing out things factually without apology or embellishment. The kitchen was functional and cold, with a wood stove that needed its chimney cleaned. The main room was large with good bones and a fireplace that had not been used in months, which explained the particular chill in the air. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs. He occupied 1, and she and the children could have the other 3, which she noted was generous arithmetic on his part, since it left him the smallest. "It's not fancy," he said, when they had come back to the kitchen. "I'm not looking for fancy," she said. "I'm looking for sound." He leaned against the kitchen doorframe with his arms crossed, and looked at her with that expression she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was thinking rather than performing. "What do you need to know?" She took out the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She had been making notes during the tour, which she had not announced but had not concealed. He had not commented on it. "Household accounts," she said. "I want to see what's been spent in the last 6 months. Not because I'm questioning anything, because I need to know what the actual baseline is before I can manage it properly." He nodded once. "I'll get them. The south windows need reglazed before the hard cold. I'll need the materials. There's a hardware account at Drummond Supplies in Cary. I'll add your name. The chimney on the kitchen stove needs cleaning or it'll be a fire risk by January. Billy can do that tomorrow? And I want to be clear about something," she said, and she looked directly at him and did not look away, because this was the part that mattered. "I'm not charity. I'll manage your household. I'll keep accurate books, and I'll do work that earns what I'm paid. My older children will work alongside your hands and earn their keep. But I'm here as an employee, not a dependent. If that changes, if you decide at some point that you're doing me a favor rather than making a business arrangement, I want you to say so directly so I can make other plans." Gideon Cross looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right, what?" "All right, I understand what you're saying, and I agree to it." He pushed off the doorframe. "I'll get the accounts." She watched him go. Behind her, from the direction of the front room, she could hear Clara asking Ruth what a chimney was, and Ruth explaining it with the patient accuracy of a 10-year-old who has recently decided that precision is important. She could hear Daniel and Samuel in some kind of low-voiced argument about which of the upstairs rooms they wanted. She could hear James outside, and when she looked through the kitchen window, she could see him standing near the near-pasture fence, watching the horses with his hands in his pockets and his posture almost relaxed. She turned back to the kitchen. She found the wood stove's damper, adjusted it, found the wood box beside it had enough to last through the evening, and lit a fire, because the kitchen was cold and there was no reason to stand in a cold kitchen when there was wood. By the time Gideon came back with the ledger, The wood stove was going, and the kitchen was beginning to hold heat, and Evelyn was standing at the window reviewing the kitchen inventory she'd found in the cupboards while waiting, because 40 minutes of doing nothing productive was not in her nature. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove, and then at her. She did not explain herself. She held out her hand for the ledger. He gave it to her. That was the beginning, not a dramatic beginning, not anything that would have looked significant to anyone observing it. Just a woman taking a ledger and a man handing it over, and a wood stove beginning to put heat into a room that had been cold too long. But beginnings rarely announced themselves at the time. They only became clear later when you looked back and tried to identify the moment the ground had shifted under everything. The first week was the hardest, and not for the reasons Evelyn had anticipated. She had expected logistical difficulty. She had expected the adjustment of 6 children in an unfamiliar house, the particular friction of new routines and unknown spaces, and the small territorial negotiations that happen when people who don't know each other start sharing the same rooms and the same wood stove and the same table. She had expected to be tired. She had not expected the town. Cary was 4 miles from the Cross Ranch, a proper town with a main street and 2 churches and a dry goods store and a telegraph office, larger than Red Valley, and as she discovered on her first trip in for supplies, possessed of the same information network that all small western towns maintained with remarkable efficiency. By the time she pulled up to Drummond's Supplies on a Thursday morning, 10 days after arriving at the ranch, the woman behind the counter knew her name, knew she had 6 children, knew she had come from Red Valley, and knew she was living at the Cross Ranch. The woman's name was Ada Crane. She was perhaps 55, with the angular, self-contained look of a woman who has been running her own business for long enough that she has stopped worrying about what anyone thinks of it. She looked at Evelyn without the overlay of evaluation that Evelyn had started to recognize, the kind of look that was really a measurement. "You're the Ward woman," Ada said. "Evelyn Ward, yes. I heard you were out at Cross's place." She began pulling the items from Evelyn's list without being asked, which meant she had already decided this was a real transaction and not one to be waited out. "He's not an easy man to work for." "He's been direct," Evelyn said carefully. "That's a polite way of putting it." Ada set a bolt of glazing rope on the counter. "He fired 2 housekeepers in 4 years. Both of them left saying he was impossible." "What did he do?" Ada paused, considered. Wouldn't let them change anything without explaining their reasoning first. Wanted to know why they were doing what they were doing, not just that they were doing it. She looked at Evelyn. Most women found that insulting. Evelyn thought about the ledger, about being asked to show her reasoning. "I don't," she said. Ada looked at her for a moment, then she went back to filling the order. "No," she said, almost to herself. "I don't suppose you would." The second difficulty, the one that crept up on her gradually over the first 2 weeks, was the hands. Pete Calloway was the one she had to work around carefully. Not because he was hostile, he wasn't, precisely, but because he was a man who had been doing things a particular way for a long time and had developed the particular inflexibility of someone who has confused familiarity with correctness. He was, she discovered, ordering feed from a supplier in Cary at a markup of nearly 15% above what the same feed cost from a supplier 40 miles east. And when she mentioned this to him with the accounts open in front of them both, he said, "We've always used Harker's." "I understand that," she said. "I'm asking why." He looked at her with the look she was beginning to recognize, the look that meant a man was deciding how much of his authority was being questioned. "It's convenient." 40 miles is not convenient, she admitted. But at the current price difference, the annual saving would be enough to replace that west fence section and have money left over. She pushed the accounts toward him. "I'm not telling you to change suppliers. I'm showing you the numbers. What you do with them is your decision." She had learned very quickly to phrase things this way. What you do with them is your decision. It was not dishonest. The decision was, properly, Pete's domain, but it also removed the sting that would otherwise make him dig in. She had not been born knowing this. She had learned it in 15 years of managing a household in proximity to men who needed to feel that they were the ones deciding things, and she had long since made her peace with the gap between where decisions technically lived and where they actually originated. Pete took the accounts, studied them, said nothing. 3 days later, she saw him writing a letter to the Eastern supplier. She did not comment on it. Billy Reck, who was 22 and from somewhere in Kansas, and who had the slightly dazed look of a young man who had ended up in Montana without entirely planning to, was easier. He was also the one who, on the third day, knocked on the kitchen door after supper and said he'd cleaned the chimney, and when she thanked him, he said, "The boys at the old place used to say you hadn't really done a job until you showed it was done," which was the kind of thing people say when they want to be seen as competent and don't quite have the confidence to just be it. She thanked him again, more specifically this time, and watched him stand a little straighter on the way back to the bunkhouse. Walt Drummond remained quiet and watchful and spoke to her directly when he needed to and not otherwise, which she respected. Gideon Cross himself was the particular puzzle of the operation. He was not what she had expected, which was itself unexpected, because she had thought she knew what to expect. She had met enough ranchers. She had been married to a man who shared many of their qualities: the capability, the self-sufficiency, the particular brand of stubbornness that made men good at surviving hard country and sometimes difficult to live near. She had expected, at some level, to find a slightly harder version of Thomas. What she found instead was a man who lived like someone who had deliberately removed all the soft edges from his life. Not because he was cruel. She had seen no evidence of cruelty, and she had been watching carefully. But because he had, somewhere along the way, decided that soft edges were a liability. His house before she arrived had been clean in the way that military quarters are clean, functional, orderly, stripped of anything that served no purpose beyond existing. There was not a single decorative object in any room. The bookshelves in the main room held practical books: livestock management, land surveying, a legal reference for territorial law. With one exception, a copy of Middlemarch that looked read and reread and that she chose not to comment on because it seemed to belong to a privacy she had not been invited into. He ate supper with them most evenings because she had set the table for everyone without making an announcement about it, and to not sit down would have required him to make a deliberate choice to exclude himself that she suspected he found more trouble than it was worth. The first evening, he had sat at the head of the table with the particular wariness of a man who is not accustomed to sharing a table with children and is reviewing his exits. Claire had asked him if he had a horse. He had said yes. She had asked what the horse's name was. He had said Slate because the horse was gray. Clara had considered this and said that was a good name for a gray horse, with the decisive authority of a 4-year-old who has just approved something. And something had moved through Gideon Cross's face that came and went so fast Evelyn almost missed it. He was not easy in any conventional sense. He asked questions about everything she changed, not to obstruct, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the reasoning, which was either maddening or refreshing depending on the day and her level of exhaustion. The first time she rearranged the kitchen, moving the dry goods to a different shelf system that put the most used items at accessible height rather than sorted by type, he came in and stood in front of the new arrangement for a moment and then said, "Why?" She explained it. Efficiency of daily use versus organizational neatness. He thought about it, nodded, walked out. The second time he asked why, when she adjusted the household account to add a weekly budget line for medical supplies, arguing that the current practice of buying them as needed was more expensive than maintaining a basic stock. He listened, asked 2 follow-up questions, and then said, "You're right." 2 words. No elaboration. She found to her slight surprise that she preferred it to elaborate agreement. The children settled in their different ways. James had been given work with Walt on the horses, which suited him in ways that were almost visible. He came back from the barn each evening with the quiet self-containment of someone who has spent the day doing work that made sense to him, and he was less brittle at the edges than he had been in Red Valley, less braced for things to go wrong. She watched this happening and felt something she didn't allow herself to name yet because there was still too much that could break. Daniel took up with Billy Reck, who was close enough to a boy himself that they had found a natural alignment. She occasionally heard them talking in the yard, Daniel asking questions that Billy answered with varying degrees of accuracy, which she considered valuable because life involved receiving inaccurate information and learning to check it. Ruth helped Evelyn in the mornings and spent the afternoons doing schoolwork that Evelyn had set up at the kitchen table, working through the books she'd brought in the trunks, with a diligence that suggested she was not doing it because she was told to, but because she had decided knowledge was an asset. The twins ran. They ran across the pasture, ran around the barn, ran back to the house, and then out again, and the ranch hands occasionally looked up from their work with expressions of mild alarm at the pair of 7-year-olds appearing and disappearing at high speed across the property. Clara followed Evelyn everywhere, which meant Evelyn's work was regularly interrupted by questions about how chimneys worked, why cows smelled the way they smelled, whether horses dreamed, and what happened to the frost after the sun came out. She answered all of these as accurately as she could, because Clara's questions were rarely simple even when they sounded that way. The weeks passed. November became December. December became the particular iron cold of a Montana winter at full strength, the kind of cold that made the air feel thin and bright, and that killed careless people who underestimated it. The ranch did not feel careless. It felt, increasingly, like something that worked. The household ran better. Not perfectly. Nothing ran perfectly, and there had been a week in mid-December when the kitchen stove developed a crack in its side plate, and Billy Reck burned a batch of mending she had asked him to bring in from the line because he forgot it was there, and she had said something sharper than she intended and felt bad about it afterward and left a piece of pie outside the bunkhouse door as a silent apology. The feed situation improved. The south windows were reglazed before the hard cold. She found, going through the household accounts, a billing error that had been going on for over a year with the lamp oil supplier, and recovering it added $11.40 to the operating budget, which she told Gideon about, and he said, "Good eye," and went back to what he was doing. She was beginning to understand him in pieces. He had built this ranch alone over 20 years. She knew this not because he had told her, but because she had done arithmetic on what the land records showed about when the property was acquired, and cross-referenced it with conversations she'd had with Ada Crane, who was the most reliable source of accurate information in Cary, not gossip. Ada was surprisingly uninterested in gossip, but fact delivered straight. What she had assembled was a picture of a man who had arrived in the territory at roughly 22 with nothing and had built something real over 2 decades by being, essentially, relentless. He'd had a partner once, early on, a man named Reeves, who had apparently decided the partnership was less interesting than a card game in Denver and had left his half of the operation to Gideon in exchange for enough cash to buy a train ticket. Gideon had bought out the debt that followed this at significant personal cost and had not, as far as Ada knew, taken on a partner since. He had also, as near as Ada could tell, been alone for long enough that it had become the condition he associated with normalcy. "He's not unfriendly," Ada said, on Evelyn's 3rd or 4th trip to the supply store, which she was beginning to suspect Ada looked forward to. "He just doesn't need people the way most people need people. Or he thinks he doesn't." She set a tin of coffee on the counter. "Hard to know, with men like that, whether they've decided they don't need something or whether they've just forgotten what it felt like to have it." Evelyn thought about the copy of Middlemarch on the shelf. Read and reread. "Maybe both," she said. Ada looked at her the way she occasionally looked at Evelyn, a look that was asking a question without quite asking it. Then she went back to adding up the tab. It was 3 days before Christmas when the first letter arrived. It came addressed to Gideon Cross, return address from Red Valley, and the handwriting on the envelope was Harold Briggs's. She recognized it from the bank correspondence she had cleared from Thomas's files, which was not a fact she had any reason to share with anyone, but which she registered with the particular attention she gave to things that felt like warnings in minor key. She put it on Gideon's desk without comment. He read it that evening after supper, when she was in the kitchen going over the December accounts, and the children were in various stages of winding towards sleep. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table across from her without preamble, which was not his usual pattern. He generally left her to work undisturbed. She looked up. "Do you know a man named Harold Briggs?" he said. She set her pen down. "Yes," she said. "He's written to several of the larger landowners in the territory." Gideon's voice was level. "He's saying that a woman of—" He glanced at the letter, and his expression did something brief and difficult to read. "Questionable character and financial irresponsibility has taken up residence on my property, and that any man of standing in the territory should be aware of the situation." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was moving through the pine brake on the north side of the property, making the low sound it made when the temperature dropped below a certain point. Clara was asleep. She could hear Samuel asking Ruth something through the ceiling. "He's trying to make trouble for you," she said, "because I left without—" She stopped, found the accurate phrasing. "Because my leaving was not on his terms." "He's also contacted the Territorial Commissioner's office," Gideon said. "He's filed a complaint suggesting that a single man housing a widow with 6 children is a situation that warrants investigation." She looked at him. He looked at her. "On what grounds?" she said, though she was fairly sure she knew. "Grounds of impropriety." He said the word the way you say a word that doesn't quite match the thing it's supposed to describe. "He's suggesting that the living arrangement is—" He consulted the letter again, and his jaw tightened slightly. "Not in keeping with the moral standards of the territory or in the best interests of the children involved." She had expected something like this. She had not expected it this fast or this formally organized. She looked at the accounts open in front of her. She looked at the December numbers, which were the best monthly numbers the ranch had posted since the accounts began 3 years ago, because she had found 4 separate inefficiencies in the first 6 weeks and fixed all of them, and the difference was measurable in black ink. "What do you want to do?" she said. It was the right question. She had learned that about him. He needed to be asked directly, not maneuvered, not presented with a fait accompli. He thought better when he was given the actual shape of a problem and invited to work on it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter on the table. "I want to know," he said, "whether Briggs is the kind of man who gives up when he's ignored, or the kind who gets worse." "The second kind," she said. "He's the second kind." He nodded slowly, like he had suspected as much. "Then ignoring this isn't a strategy," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't." Another silence. The wind moved in the pine brake. Somewhere upstairs, Samuel had apparently been answered by Ruth and had gone quiet. "I'll write to my lawyer in Helena," Gideon said. "First thing tomorrow." He folded the letter, put it in his pocket. "You should know that I'm not in the habit of letting other people's letters determine what happens on my property." She looked at him. "I know that," she said. "But this isn't just about your property anymore." He met her eyes, and this time the thing that moved through his expression was not fast. It stayed there long enough that she could see it clearly. Not pity, nothing like pity, but a seriousness that had weight to it, the kind that came from actually reckoning with something rather than dismissing it. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." He stood up, moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," he said, without turning around, "the numbers you gave Pete about the feed supplier. He made the change. It's going to save us close to $200 this year." She said nothing. "I noticed," he said. "That's all." He walked out. She sat at the table with the accounts in front of her and the wood stove going and the wind in the pine trees, and she thought about Harold Briggs writing letters to people in the territory with his careful, smiling handwriting, and she thought about the particular tiredness of being a woman who keeps winning small things only to find that someone has simply moved the fight to new ground. Then she picked up her pen, opened the accounts to December, and kept working. Because that was what you did. You kept the numbers. You kept going. You did not let the fact that someone was trying to build a case against your existence stop you from making the existence worth defending. Outside, the Montana cold pressed against the windows. Inside, the stove held, and in the morning, there was still work to be done. The lawyer's letter from Helena arrived on a Thursday, and it was not good news. Evelyn knew this before Gideon said anything about it, because she had learned to read him in the small ways. The particular set of his shoulders when he came in from the barn, the way he placed things on the table rather than setting them down, the 3-second delay before he spoke when he was choosing his words more carefully than usual. He put the letter on the kitchen table while she was making the morning inventory of the dry goods, and he stood beside the wood stove with his arms crossed, and she put down her pencil and read it. The commissioner's office had received Harold Briggs's complaint, and in the language of the letter, found sufficient grounds to conduct a review of the living situation at the Cross Ranch property, with particular regard to the welfare of 6 minor children currently residing therein. A territorial inspector would be arriving within 30 days. The review would include interviews with the children, with relevant community members, and with both adults present on the property. Community members, she said. That's the part I'd worry about too, Gideon said. She set the letter down, looked at the window, which showed the January morning in all its gray and uncompromising clarity. He'll have spoken to Mercer, and Briggs will have reached out to whoever he knows in Cary, because that's who the inspector will talk to. I know 3 men on the county board, Gideon said. 2 of them will be fair. One of them owes Briggs a favor from the land dispute 2 years back. She looked at him. How large a favor? Large enough that I wouldn't count on his honesty. She thought about this. Outside, she could hear Daniel and Billy Reck crossing the yard, Daniel's voice rising and falling the way it did when he was explaining something he had just learned and hadn't quite finished understanding. The sound of it, the ordinary living sound of a boy explaining something to an adult who was mostly listening, tightened something in her chest that she did not allow to show on her face. The children, she said. Yes. If they find grounds, they won't find grounds, he said. The children are healthy and accounted for and in a clean house with regular meals and Gideon. She said his name the way she said it when he was doing the thing he did, which was projecting forward to the logical outcome without spending enough time on the distance between here and there. I know what the grounds look like on paper. I'm asking what happens if Briggs has already shaped the opinion of the people they'll ask. He was quiet. She watched him think. Connolly, he said finally. The judge? He's in Millbrook. I've known him 12 years. He's not on the county board, but he carries weight with the commissioner's office, and Briggs doesn't have a line to him. He uncrossed his arms. I can ride to Millbrook in a day. And ask him what exactly? Ask him what the legal exposure actually is, not what the letter implies, what the law actually says about this kind of complaint, and what it can and cannot compel. It was a good instinct, better than her first instinct, which had been to write a letter to every person in Cary who knew the state of the household and ask them to speak to the inspector. She had dismissed that instinct because it had the shape of panic, and she did not want to organize her defense around panic. Go to Millbrook, she said. I'll talk to Ada. He looked at her. Ada Crane? She's been in Cary 30 years. She knows which people the inspector will seek out and which ones will tell the truth and which ones can be, she found the word, reminded of relevant facts before he arrives. Something moved through Gideon's expression that was not quite humor, but was in the same family. I'll leave in the morning, he said. She nodded, picked up her pencil, went back to the inventory, because the inventory needed to be done, and standing in the kitchen feeling the shape of a threat did not make the threat smaller. He left at first light. She heard the hooves on the frozen ground even in her room at the back of the house, a sound that faded north toward the main road and then was gone. And she lay in the gray dark for 10 minutes thinking through everything she knew and everything she did not know. And then she got up and started the kitchen fire because the day did not wait on anyone's anxiety. Her conversation with Ada Crane happened that afternoon in the back room of the supply store where Ada kept her accounts. Ada listened to all of it without interruption. She was the kind of woman who let you finish, which was rarer than it should have been. And then she was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was sorting through information by a system of her own that was not entirely visible from the outside. Briggs has been busy, she said finally. What have you heard? The Holloways came through last week. Ada's voice was careful and accurate. Margaret Holloway specifically. She told Ruth Partridge at the dry goods that she was concerned about the situation at the Cross Place, specifically about the children. The name landed like a stone. Margaret, who had stood in her own doorway last November and said, "We can't get involved." What did she say about the children? Evelyn said. That they were living in an irregular situation and that a woman in your circumstances might not be the most stable influence on young ones. Ada paused. Those are Margaret Holloway's words as reported through Ruth Partridge, which means they've been through at least 2 filters and are probably somewhat worse than what Margaret actually said. Or better, Evelyn said. Ada conceded this with a slight incline of her head. The inspector, when he comes, he'll likely talk to the Holloways because George Holloway is the kind of man whose opinion an inspector from the commissioner's office will weight heavily whether or not it's earned. He owns a lot of land. He knows the right people. Is there anyone in Cary who will speak without a vested interest? Ada looked at her steadily. I will, she said. Evelyn looked at her. I've kept books on half the ranches in this county for 30 years, Ada said. The Cross Ranch books I haven't seen, but I know what the operational numbers look like when a household is being managed properly and when it isn't. A ranch that's running clean in January with 6 additional mouths and a new manager is not a household in crisis. She folded her hands on the desk. I'll say what I've observed, which is that you've come in here 4 times in 8 weeks. You know what things cost. You buy what you need and not what you don't, and you don't have the look of a woman who is failing. It was the most Ada Crane had said to her in one stretch. It was also, Evelyn realized, the most direct statement of support she had received from anyone outside the ranch since October. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Ada said. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because the truth is the truth, and I'm too old to pretend otherwise to a government inspector. She stood up. I'll also speak to the Reverend Michaels. He married 2 of the Cross Ranch hands in the last decade, and he has standing in this community that the Holloways can't touch. Evelyn nodded. She did not mention that she had been avoiding the Reverend's congregation since arriving in Cary, because organized religion had always made her feel, for reasons she could not fully articulate, like she was being measured against a standard she had never agreed to. She appreciated Ada's practical deployment of the Reverend as a community resource. She drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the cold coming down hard, and she was within a mile of the gate when she saw the riders. There were 3 of them on the road from the east, and they were not moving with the purposeful efficiency of men going somewhere specific. They were moving with the particular lazy confidence of men who know they have the numbers and aren't in a hurry to arrive. One of them she recognized from a distance by the set of his hat, Dale Mercer. She kept the wagon moving at the same pace. She did not speed up because speeding up said something she didn't want to say. She did not slow down because slowing down said something else she didn't want to say. Mercer pulled his horse around to face her direction when she was close enough to make conversation unavoidable. The other 2 spread slightly, a casual flanking that was not casual. Evelyn, he said. Mr. Mercer. He looked at the wagon, at the empty bed, since the children were at the ranch. Heard you were in Cary, he said. Buying supplies, yes. Long trip for supplies. I find it worth it, she said. He was quiet for a moment, rolling his toothpick. Cross isn't home, he said. He'll be back tomorrow. I know. He looked at her with the look he'd had that first morning on the road out of Red Valley. That calibrating look. The one trying to find the leverage point. Briggs is serious about this, Evelyn. I want you to understand that. He's not a man who files complaints and then moves on. I'm aware of that. He's also a man who knows how to make things difficult for people who don't cooperate. Mercer shifted in his saddle. There's an easier way through this. She waited. You go back to Red Valley, quietly. Briggs drops the complaint. The inspector doesn't come. The whole thing goes away. You find somewhere else to land. There's a boarding house in Miller Creek that I know of, and they take women with children. She looked at him. She looked at the horizon behind him, the particular flat Montana sky in January, pale and enormous and indifferent. And if I don't? She said. He met her eyes. Then Briggs makes it as hard as it can possibly be. She picked up the reins. Tell Harold, she said, that I've had hard before. She drove through them, not around them, through them, holding the horses to their pace so that Mercer had to move aside or be walked into. And she kept her back straight and her eyes on the gate of the Cross Ranch, and she did not look back until she was through the gate and the riders were on the other side of it. Her hand shook for about 30 seconds. Then they stopped. She went inside and made supper. Gideon came back from Millbrook the following evening, later than she'd expected, and he came back with 2 things: a detailed account of his conversation with Judge Connolly and a face that said the account was not simple. He sat down at the kitchen table after supper, when the children were upstairs and Pete Calloway had gone to the bunkhouse, and he put his hat on the table beside him and looked at her with that directness she had come to rely on because it never dressed things up into something they weren't. The good news, he said, is that Connolly says the complaint as filed has no legal weight on its own. A territorial inspector can make a recommendation, but he cannot remove children from a household on the basis of a complaint alone. It requires a formal judicial proceeding. And the bad news? A formal judicial proceeding is exactly what Briggs is angling for. Connolly says he's done it before, used the inspector process to generate enough documentation to bring a case before the county magistrate. And the magistrate in this county owes Briggs, she said. He looked at her. You knew that already? I guessed. There's usually a magistrate. She was quiet for a moment. What can Connolly do? He's agreed to review the inspector's findings when they come in. He has standing to override the county magistrate's court if the proceeding is procedurally improper, and Connolly is of the opinion that anything Briggs has engineered will be procedurally improper in at least 2 ways. He paused. But that assumes the inspector's report doesn't contain something that gives them legitimate grounds. She understood the weight he put on that last sentence. She looked at the table. Something like what? She said, though she needed to hear him say it. Something like evidence that the children are being neglected, or that the household is financially unstable, or that the living arrangement is, he used the word again, flat, improper. They sat with that word for a moment. She had known it was coming. She had been running calculations on it in the back of her mind since Gideon had first told her about Briggs's letter, the way you run calculations on a problem you don't want to look at directly. A single man, a widow. The same house, the territory in 1882, which had opinions about these arrangements that it was not shy about enforcing. Connolly suggested, Gideon said, and his voice had gone to its most careful register, the one he used when he was saying something he had thought about for a long time and was not entirely sure how the other person would receive it, that the most direct way to remove the legal vulnerability is to remove the grounds for the complaint. She was very still. He said, Gideon continued, that a married couple living together on a ranch with children is not a situation the commissioner's office will interfere with. The complaint becomes meaningless. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working on the north side of the house with the particular persistence it had in January. I see, she said. I want to be clear about what I'm saying, he said. I'm not saying it would be anything. I'm not asking you to. He stopped, started over, and she had the impression that he had rehearsed several versions of this on the 40-mile ride back from Millbrook, and none of them had sounded right to him. It would be a legal arrangement for the purpose of protecting you and the children from whatever Briggs is building. That's all I'm offering. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. She had been in this kitchen for 2 months, and she had spent a great deal of that time learning to read Gideon Cross, and what she had assembled was a complicated portrait, a man who was capable and private and occasionally difficult, who asked questions instead of making assumptions, who had held his life at arm's length from other people for so long that the distance had become habitual rather than chosen, who kept a copy of Middlemarch on his shelf and read it until the spine cracked. She did not believe, looking at him now, that he was offering her a legal arrangement for purely strategic reasons. She believed that he thought he was, and she believed that the distinction mattered, and that it was not, right now, the most important thing to address. I need to think about it, she said. He nodded. I know. It's not... She stopped, chose her words the way she chose her words when something was true but also complicated. It's not a simple question. No, he said. It's not. He picked up his hat and stood, and she thought he was going to leave it there, which would have been like him, but he stopped at the kitchen door. For what it's worth, he said to the door frame rather than to her, the arrangement, the current one, is the first time in a long time that this house has had a fire in it that wasn't just for heat. Then he went out. She sat at the table for a long time. She was not a woman given to romantic sentiment. She had loved Thomas Ward with the practical, durable love of two people who had built something real together over a long time, and she did not mistake what she felt in the months after his death, the acute physical absence of another person who knew you, for something that could or should be quickly replaced. She was 41 years old, and she had 6 children and a complicated legal situation, and she was not going to make a decision about this based on the fact that a man had said something kind about her ability to maintain a household fire. But she was also not someone who refused to look at a thing directly. She looked at it. She thought about what the children needed. She thought about James, who was sleeping better since he came to this ranch. She thought about Clara asking Gideon about his horse's name and the expression on his face when she approved it. She thought about what it meant to have a legal standing that Briggs could not attack versus what it meant to make a decision about her life under duress. She thought about both of those things being true at the same time. She was still thinking about it when the knock came at the back door. It was Pete Calloway. He was holding his hat in his hands the way he only did when he was uncomfortable, and he looked like a man who had been working up to something and had decided to just get it done. "Mrs. Ward," he said. "Pete, I need to tell you something." He looked at the hat, looked at her. "You know, I wasn't easy about you coming here. I want to say that straight out." "I know that," she said. "The thing about the feed supplier." He shifted his weight. "I was stubborn about it, and you were right, and I was stubborn about it anyway, and that's on me." She waited because there was more coming. "Briggs has been writing to people," he said. "I got a letter too, from one of his associates, I guess you'd say, asking me what the situation was out here. Whether there was—" He stopped, and his jaw went hard in a way that told her he was angry, not at her. "Whether there was anything irregular." She was very still. "What did you say?" "I said the ranch was running better than it had in 3 years, and the woman managing the household kept better books than I'd ever seen, and the children were healthy and working honest. And if there was anything irregular about any of that, then I didn't know the meaning of the word." He met her eyes. "I want you to know I said that, so you know where I stand." She had to take a moment, not because she was surprised exactly. Pete Calloway was a man who had a strong sense of what was correct, even when it took him a while to arrive at it. She had known this about him for weeks, but knowing a thing and having it confirmed in a letter written against your interest were different weights. "Thank you, Pete," she said. He nodded, put his hat back on. "Walt and Billy feel the same way," he said. "I can't speak for them, but I'm fairly sure." He moved toward the door, stopped. "Cross is a good man," he said. "He's not easy, but he's good." He went out. She sat back down at the table. 3 days later, the letter arrived from Margaret Holloway. She knew the handwriting. She had seen it on years of social correspondence, invitations to women's meetings, holiday cards, the note Margaret had sent when Samuel and Eliza were born. "So happy for you both. Such a blessing. We must come to see them soon." She had not opened a letter from Margaret in over 2 months. She had not expected to be receiving one. She opened it in the kitchen, standing, which was how she read things she was not sure she wanted to be sitting down for. It was 2 pages. The first page was apology, which was genuine enough in its way. Margaret was not a woman comfortable with dishonesty, and the letter showed the strain of it, the overworked sentences of someone trying to find the right architecture for something she was ashamed of. She had been wrong, she wrote, to close her door. She had been afraid, which was true, and she had let George's fear become her own, which was also true, and she was sorry for it. The second page was the reason for the letter. George Holloway had been contacted by Briggs. Briggs had asked George to provide a statement to the territorial inspector supporting the removal of the children from the Cross property. George had agreed. Margaret was telling her this against her husband's knowledge. She wrote, "I cannot stop George from doing what he intends to do, but I could not let you be surprised by it. Whatever else has happened between us, you deserve to not be ambushed." Evelyn folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket. She finished the morning work, stoked the fires, checked the pantry, brought the accounts up to date, and then she went to find Gideon. He was in the near pasture with Walt, looking at one of the horses that had been favoring a foreleg since yesterday. She waited at the fence until Walt had said his piece and moved off, and then she went through the gate and crossed the frozen ground and stood beside Gideon and told him about the letter. He listened without interrupting. He looked at the horse while he listened. "Holloway's statement will be what Briggs needs to make it formal," he said when she had finished. "Yes." "When is the inspector arriving?" The letter said within 30 days from the date it was sent. That was 2.5 weeks ago. He was quiet for a moment. "How much time do we have?" 11 days? Maybe 12? He turned to look at her, and what was in his face was not panic. She had never seen panic in him, but something that had the weight of a decision that had been made and was now being stated plainly. "I meant what I said," he said. About the offer. She looked at him. She had spent 3 days carrying the question. She had taken it apart and put it back together and looked at it from the angle of her children and the angle of her own life and the angle of what was practical and the angle of what was true. And she had not quite arrived at a single clean answer because she was not sure a single clean answer existed. "I know you did," she said. "The question is whether you—" "The question," she said, "is whether I'm making this decision because it's the right decision or because Harold Briggs has backed me into a corner." She looked at him steadily. "And I need you to understand that those are different things. The first one I can live with. The second one I'm not sure about." He looked at her for a long time. "I understand that," he said, "but I need you to understand something back." He turned to face her fully, which he did not do often when he was saying something important, and the fact that he did it now registered. "I didn't ride to Millbrook for legal strategy. I rode to Millbrook because I wanted to know what the strongest protection was, and that's what Connolly told me." He paused. "I'm a man who asks why before he does things. You know that about me." She did. "I asked myself why," he said. "About this. About the offer." She waited. "The answer wasn't only strategy," he said. The pasture was very quiet around them. The horse had stopped favoring the leg and had moved to the far fence where the dried grass was less frozen. The sky was the color it got in January when the cold was serious, a particular shade of white that was not actually white, more like light that had given up trying to be warm. She thought about what he had said the night he came back from Millbrook, standing in the kitchen door. The first time in a long time this house has had a fire in it that wasn't just for heat. "I need a few more days," she said. He nodded. No argument, no pressure, just a nod, the way he nodded when he understood something and was filing it correctly. They walked back to the house in the cold, not close, not distant, and she held the letter from Margaret in her apron pocket and thought about the shape of the things she was being asked to decide, and about the 11 days left before an inspector arrived, and about the difference between a decision made in freedom and a decision made in a corner, and about whether that difference could still matter when both roads led somewhere real. That evening, James came to find her after supper. He sat down at the kitchen table with the deliberate settling of a boy who has practiced what he's about to say. She let him practice it in silence. "Mama," he said, "James, are we going to have to leave?" She looked at her son, at the 14-year-old who had put his father's watch in his pocket every day since October and not said a word about it to anyone, who had told her on the wagon out of Red Valley, "We're going to be all right, aren't we?" and had said it like a question that needed to be a statement. "I don't know yet," she said. He was quiet. "Do you want to leave?" She thought about it. She gave him the truth. "No," she said. "I don't." He nodded slowly. "I don't either," he said, "and not just because of the horses." He paused. "Mr. Cross, he's—" He was looking for the word. She waited for him to find it. "He shows me things. Not because he has to, because he thinks I should know them." She looked at her son. "Like what things?" she said. "How to read a horse's leg to know if it's a muscle problem or a bone problem. How to check a fence line for the spots that'll go first in a hard freeze. He told me last week that the east pasture soil drains better than the west pasture, and that matters for where you put the cattle in spring." James paused. "He doesn't explain it like I'm a child. He explains it like I'm someone who should know." She was quiet for a moment. "He's a good teacher," she said. "Yes." James looked at his hands on the table. "I know you have to decide what's right. I know it's not simple. I'm not asking you to do something because of me." He looked up. "But I wanted you to know how it is from my side." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. She did not say anything, because there was nothing she needed to add. He sat there for a minute, then stood up the way he stood now, with a straightness that had not been in him in Red Valley, that had come from somewhere in the last 2 months, and said good night and went upstairs. She stayed at the table. Outside, the wind was working on the north side of the house. The wood stove was doing what it did. The ranch was doing what it did, in the dark and the cold and the January that pressed down on everything equally. She thought about Harold Briggs and his careful letters. She thought about George Holloway's statement. She thought about 11 days. She thought about what James had said. He explains it like I'm someone who should know. She thought about Gideon Cross in the near pasture, saying the answer wasn't only strategy, with the directness of a man who has made a practice of knowing why he does things and has arrived at an answer he is not going to dress up or back away from. She reached into her apron pocket and took out the letter from Margaret Holloway. She read the second page again. Whatever else has happened between us, you deserve to not be ambushed. She thought, yes, and the people who matter are the ones who believe that, even when it costs them something. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept the household accounts, because she was a woman who kept things she might need later. Then she went to find Gideon. He was in the main room, not reading, which was unusual. He generally read in the evenings. He was sitting in the chair by the fireplace, looking at the fire in the way that meant he was thinking rather than seeing. And when she came in, he did not look startled, which also told her something. She sat down in the chair across from him. I've thought about it, she said. He looked at her, said nothing. I'm not doing it because of Briggs, she said. I want to be clear about that, because I need to be clear about it for myself as much as for you. I'm not marrying you because a man in Red Valley is trying to take my children. Then why? He said. She looked at him across the fire. Because you handed me a ledger, she said, and because you didn't look at me on the road like you'd already decided, and because my son just told me you explain things to him like he's someone who should know. She paused. And because the answer wasn't only strategy for me either, and I've been honest enough with myself to admit that. The fire made its sounds. Gideon Cross looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the assessment look, not the thinking look, but something that was quieter and more unguarded than either, and that she thought might be what he looked like when he was not managing anything, including himself. All right, he said. All right, she said. They sat in the main room for a while, not saying anything else, and the fire held against the January dark, and outside the Montana cold did what it always did. Pressed in from every direction, patient and enormous and absolutely indifferent to the small, warm, complicated decisions being made inside. They were married on a Wednesday in the Cary County Clerk's office, with Ada Crane and Walt Drummond as witnesses, and 5 of the 6 children present, Clara having fallen asleep in the wagon on the way into town and been left in Billy Rex's reluctant care at the hitching post outside. It was not a ceremony in any conventional sense. Judge Hendricks, who served as county clerk on the days he wasn't serving as something else, read the required language from a document that was worn at the fold lines from years of being opened and closed, and Gideon Cross said the required words with the same quality of attention he gave to everything. Not perfunctory, but not performing either. And Evelyn said hers in a voice that was steady because she had decided it would be steady, and she had a long history of her voice doing what she decided. Ada had brought flowers, which no one had asked her to do and which surprised everyone, including, briefly, Ada herself, who presented them to Evelyn with an expression that suggested she was mildly embarrassed by her own sentiment and would prefer not to discuss it. James shook Gideon's hand afterward, which Gideon accepted without making a thing of it, and Daniel said, "Are we supposed to do something now?" And Ruth told him quietly that they were supposed to not say that, and the twins stood together holding hands the way they always did in situations they hadn't fully processed yet. They drove back to the ranch in 2 wagons. It was, in its way, exactly the wedding it needed to be, unadorned and functional and real, which Evelyn had decided was better than adorned and performative and hollow, and which Gideon seemed to agree with, though he did not say so in those words. What he said, on the drive back, when the children had sorted themselves into the second wagon, with Walt and the road ahead, was empty enough to talk. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "You?" He thought about it, which was his habit, actually thinking about questions rather than answering them automatically. "Yes," he said. "I think I am." She looked at the road. That's about as much certainty as anyone should have on their wedding day. He made a sound that was, she was fairly sure, a laugh, small and brief and something he didn't seem to have much practice with, but a laugh. The inspector arrived 9 days later. His name was Theodore Marsh, and he was from the commissioner's office in Helena, and he was a compact, serious man of about 50 who arrived alone on a bay horse and who looked, when Evelyn opened the door to him, like someone who had spent a long career trying to make accurate assessments and had developed a professional distrust of first impressions as a consequence. He did not smile. He did not frown. He looked at the house, at Evelyn, at the main room behind her, and he said, "Mrs. Cross, I'm Theodore Marsh from the Commissioner's office. I believe you've been expecting me." "We have," she said. "Please come in." She showed him into the main room, which was warm and clean, and which contained, on the large table, a set of organized documents that she and Gideon had prepared over the previous week. The household accounts for the 3 months she had been managing the property, the children's records, the ranch's operational numbers for the past year with the current quarter broken out separately, and a brief written statement from each of the 3 ranch hands attesting to the condition of the household and the children. She had not staged the room. She had simply made sure that everything he might want to see was findable without her having to locate it under pressure. There was a difference. Marsh looked at the table, looked at her, looked at the documents with the expression of a man recalibrating slightly. "Is Mr. Cross available?" he said. "He's in the barn. I can get him." "In a moment." He sat down, not waiting to be invited, which told her something about his method. He was the kind of man who moved at his own pace and let other people adjust. "I'd like to speak with you first, if you don't mind." "Of course," she said. She sat across from him and put her hands on the table and waited. He asked questions for 40 minutes. They were thorough questions, not hostile, but not soft either, and he did not accept summary where he could have specifics. He wanted to know the exact date she had arrived at the property, the exact nature of the arrangement before the marriage, the daily routine of the children, the schooling situation, the medical situation, the financial situation. He asked about Red Valley and about Thomas's death and about the debts, and she answered all of it without deflecting, because she had learned a long time ago that deflection was more expensive than the thing it was meant to protect. When she told him about the sewing machine and Dale Mercer on the road, he wrote something in his notebook. When she told him about Harold Briggs's letters to the landowners in the territory, he wrote something else. "Mrs. Cross," he said, at some point in the middle of this, "I want to be direct with you about something." "Please," she said. "The complaint as filed with our office characterizes this household as a situation of financial instability and moral irregularity, and it suggests that the children are in circumstances that do not serve their welfare." He looked at her steadily. "I have conducted 17 of these reviews in my career. I try to arrive at each one without a conclusion already formed." He paused. "This complaint has a particular quality to it that I recognized before I left Helena. I'm not going to tell you what that quality is, because my job is to look at what's actually here, not at what I suspected before I arrived. But I want you to know that I'm looking." She held his gaze. "That's all I'm asking," she said. He spent 2 hours on the property. He spoke to Gideon for 30 minutes in the main room after Evelyn had stepped out. He spoke to Pete Calloway, to Walt Drummond, to Billy Reck. He looked at the children's sleeping arrangements, at the kitchen, at the pantry. He asked Clara, with what appeared to be genuine gentleness, what she had for breakfast, and Clara told him in considerable detail about the oatmeal and the way Gideon put molasses in his, and the way the twins had argued about who got the spoon first, which was the kind of specific domestic information that no one could fabricate on short notice. He asked James what he was learning on the ranch. James told him about reading a horse's leg, about fence lines, about east pasture drainage. Marsh wrote in his notebook. He asked Ruth about her schoolwork. Ruth showed him the books and her completed exercises with the calm of a 10-year-old who has been raised to not be intimidated by authority figures, which was a quality Evelyn had not deliberately instilled in her, but which seemed to have grown there anyway. In the early afternoon, Marsh asked to speak to Evelyn again, privately, in the kitchen. She had been expecting this, the second conversation, after the data. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, and he looked at his notebook and then at her and said, "I'll be visiting 3 other households in the county before I compile my report. I am not going to tell you what my findings will be because they are not complete yet. What I will tell you is that I intend to speak to Mr. Briggs when I return to the eastern part of the territory." She was very still. "Why?" "Because when I review a complaint," he said, "I review the complaint itself as well as the situation it describes." He closed his notebook. "Mr. Briggs's letter contained several specific characterizations of this household that I have now observed directly, and I take discrepancies seriously. She looked at him. She thought about Harold Briggs at his desk in the Cattleman's Bank, writing letters in his careful handwriting to landowners across the territory. She thought about the word discrepancies. "How long until your report is filed?" she said. 3 weeks, approximately. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," he said, standing, "you conduct your household the way you've been conducting it, which from what I can observe is considerably better than the picture painted in the complaint." He put his hat on. "I'll see myself out." She sat in the kitchen for 5 minutes after she heard the front door close. Then she went to find Gideon. He was at the fence of the near pasture, watching Marsh ride down the road toward the main gate, and he had the expression of a man who has been waiting for something to be over and is not yet quite sure it is. "Well?" she said. "He's thorough," Gideon said. "Yes." "He asked me things I wasn't expecting him to ask." She looked at him. "Like what?" "Like how I came to offer you work in the first place. What I saw when I came around the bend on that road." He was quiet for a moment. "I told him the truth, that you were sitting on that wagon like you were prepared to drive it through a wall if the wall didn't move." She was quiet. "He wrote it down," Gideon said. "What do you think he'll find?" she said. He turned to look at her. "I think he'll find what's here," he said, "which is a working ranch and healthy children and a household that runs better than it did." He paused. "And I think he'll find that the man who filed the complaint has a pattern." She hoped he was right. She did not say this because hope stated aloud had a way of making the distance between where you were and where you wanted to be feel larger rather than smaller, and there was still a great deal of distance left to cross. The 3 weeks passed in the way of all 3-week periods that contain something you are waiting on, unevenly, with certain days moving at normal speed and certain days that seemed to be operating on a different accounting of time entirely. The work continued. There was always work, and she had learned early in her adult life that work was the most reliable antidote to the kind of anxiety that liked to settle in and grow if you left it unattended. She reorganized the spring supply orders based on the patterns she'd identified in the previous year's accounts. She worked with James on his reading, which had always been slower than his intelligence, a gap that Thomas had never had the patience for, and that she had found, in the evenings at the kitchen table, was mostly a matter of method rather than capacity. She found a system that worked for him, and he made progress that was real and visibly satisfying to him, which satisfied her in a way that was hard to articulate and that she did not try to. Gideon watched this happen without commenting on it, which she had come to understand as his form of approval. He did not praise things that were simply being done correctly, but he noticed them, and the noticing was its own thing. What changed in those 3 weeks was something she had not expected to change. It was not a single moment. It was an accumulation of ordinary things that kept adding up to something that was not ordinary. It was Gideon at the kitchen table going over the spring planting schedule, asking her opinion on the timing of the east pasture rotation in a way that was not courtesy. He actually wanted to know what she thought, because she had spent 3 months watching the soil and the drainage and had observations he didn't have. It was the evening Walt Drummond's horse threw a shoe 2 miles from the ranch in the dark and cold, and Gideon was gone before anyone had finished saying what had happened. Just gone, out the door, and on slate with a lantern, and back an hour later with Walt and both horses, saying nothing about it because it was simply the thing that needed doing. It was the Sunday morning when Clara had a croup cough that woke the house at 4 in the morning, and Evelyn was up and in Clara's room before she was fully awake, and Gideon was in the doorway 5 minutes later with a kettle of steaming water and a towel, because he had apparently been awake anyway, or had heard the cough from his room at the other end of the hall, and he held the towel over Clara's head while the steam did its work and said nothing, just sat there in the pre-dawn dark, big and quiet and present. Clara fell back to sleep. Gideon carried the kettle back to the kitchen. Evelyn sat beside Clara's bed for a while afterward and thought about the shape of things. She had told him, in the main room on the night they decided, that the answer wasn't only strategy for her either. She had meant it. She had not fully understood what she meant by it until these 3 weeks of watching him be, simply and without performance, The kind of person she had not expected to find in the particular corner of the world she had ended up in. The report from Marsh arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after his visit. It came addressed to the commissioner's office in Helena, with a copy forwarded to Judge Connolly in Millbrook, and Gideon's lawyer in Helena sent a summary by telegraph the same day it was filed. The telegraph reached the ranch on a Friday morning, and Evelyn read it standing in the main room with Gideon beside her and Pete Calloway in the doorway, because he had been the one who rode in from Cary with it, and he deserved to know what it said. The summary was 4 sentences. Inspector Marsh's report found no evidence of neglect, financial instability, or impropriety in the Cross household. The children were found to be in good health, adequately educated, and in a stable domestic environment. The complaint was found to contain multiple characterizations inconsistent with observed conditions. The commissioner's office was initiating a review of the complaint's origins. Pete Calloway made a sound that was not quite a word. Evelyn read the 4 sentences twice. "The last sentence," she said. "I saw it," Gideon said. "A review of the complaint's origins." She looked at him. "That's Marsh going back to Briggs." "Yes." "What does that mean for Briggs?" "It means," Gideon said carefully, "that filing a false complaint with the commissioner's office is not without consequences, and that Marsh is apparently the kind of man who takes that seriously." She put the telegraph down on the table. She thought about Harold Briggs in his bank, with his careful handwriting and his 2 words, "Get out," and the particular assurance of a man who had spent his career getting what he wanted by knowing who the right people were and how to reach them. She thought about what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that assurance, standing in the bank with 6 children outside in the cold and a loan application in her hand. She felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but that lived in the territory between them. "Pete," she said. He looked at her from the doorway. "Thank you for riding in," she said. He nodded, put his hat on. "I'll get back to the cattle," he said, and went out, and she could tell by the way he walked that he was pleased, and that he did not want to be seen being pleased, which was so consistent with everything she knew about him that it made her feel a warmth for him that surprised her. What happened next, she had not anticipated. The letter from Harold Briggs arrived 2 weeks after the telegraph. It was addressed to Gideon Cross, and it was a legal letter, drafted with the precision of someone who had access to a lawyer and was using that lawyer to do something very specific. It acknowledged the commissioner's review of his complaint. It stated that he was withdrawing the complaint in its current form. It stated, in the flat language of legal correspondence, that he wished to resolve the matter without further official involvement. Beneath the legal language was a handwritten note. It said, "The loan documents for the Ward property have been reviewed by my legal counsel. It has been brought to my attention that the sewing machine listed in the foreclosure inventory was incorrectly included. Enclosed, please find a formal correction of the original foreclosure terms." She read the note 3 times. She set it on the table. Gideon, who had been reading over her shoulder, which he did not usually do, but she had not told him to stop, said, "He's withdrawing before Marsh's review goes further." "Yes," she said. "He's trying to close the door before it gets opened." "Yes? Does that bother you?" She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "It does. Because it means he's not being held to account for any of it, just retreating." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Connolly will know what Marsh found," he said. "Connolly has a long memory." She looked at him. "Long enough," he said, "that the next time Briggs wants to file something with any official office in this territory, he'll find it somewhat harder than it used to be." She understood what he was saying, not justice exactly, not the particular satisfaction of a formal reckoning, but something practical and real, a door made narrower, a man's reach shortened by the documented fact of what he had tried to do. She picked up the letter and put it in the drawer with Margaret Holloway's letter and the household accounts, because she was a woman who kept things, and because sometimes the keeping was its own form of protection. Spring came the way Montana springs came, grudgingly, in increments, with cold snapping back without warning on days that had started to feel almost warm, as though the season was not ready to commit to itself yet. The first week of April brought mud and the particular work of a ranch emerging from winter, and the activity on the property shifted in character, less inward, less about maintenance and survival, more about growth and what came next. She had been at the ranch 5 months. She could feel the 5 months in the land. The fact that she had watched it through the full depth of a Montana winter, knew where the ice collected and where the drainage was poor, and where the stock preferred to shelter when the north wind came. She knew the property the way you know something you have paid attention to through difficult conditions rather than just in the easy seasons. She also knew the people on it differently than she had in November. Pete Calloway had changed the feed supplier in December and had not mentioned it again, but he had started in January to bring the monthly cost comparisons to her before filing them, which was not something she had asked him to do, and which told her that he had decided her eye for numbers was an asset rather than an intrusion. Walt Drummond said almost nothing more than he had ever said, but he had taken to stopping by the kitchen in the late afternoon on the days he and James worked the horses together, and reporting on what James had done and how he had done it, with the meticulous accuracy of a man who understood that a mother might want to know these things. Billy Reck had asked her, in February, whether she thought he should send money home to his mother in Kansas, which was such a personal question from someone she had known such a short time that it had surprised her, and which she had answered as directly as he'd asked, because it seemed wrong to retreat into vagueness when he had trusted her with something real. James was the one she watched the most carefully, and the most covertly, because she was his mother, and watching him was something she had been doing his entire life, and she had learned to do it without appearing to. He had grown 3 inches since October, which was partly the ward height asserting itself and partly something else. A physical expansion that came from a boy who was doing work that matched his capacity. He was up before dawn most mornings, not because anyone told him to be, but because the horses needed attending and he had decided that was his work. He and Gideon had developed a rapport that operated mostly in silence and that she had learned not to interpret as distance. It was simply how both of them functioned, in the particular quiet of shared work where words were only necessary when something needed saying. She had watched this develop over months with a feeling she kept to herself, because it was complex and she did not want to simplify it. Thomas had loved James in the uncomplicated way of a father who sees himself in his son and loves what he sees. Gideon loved James in a different way, or something that was becoming love. She was watching it grow, and she knew it for what it was, even if neither of them would have named it that yet. He loved the boy's capacity. He loved the stubbornness, which in a barn or on a fence line was not stubbornness but tenacity, and which Gideon recognized because he had built his entire life on the same quality. He was not trying to replace Thomas. He was not trying to be anything in particular. He was just present and consistent and paying attention, and sometimes that was the whole of what a person needed. She had thought about this, the relationship between presence and love in the long winter evenings. She had thought about how Thomas's love had been large and certain and had filled the room the way certain people fill rooms. You always knew where he was, always felt the weight of his attention. Gideon's was different. It was quieter and it crept up on you, and sometimes she did not realize it had been there until it was gone for a day and the absence was noticeable. She found this unsettling in a way that was not unpleasant. She did not examine it too closely, because the thing about examining things too closely was that you sometimes dissolved them in the process. What she examined instead was practical. She was managing a ranch. She was doing it well. The spring numbers showed this clearly, and she had shown them to Gideon with the same objectivity she showed everything. The operational improvement from November to April was measurable in 3 separate categories. He had looked at the numbers for a long time and then said, "This is good work." 2 words. But she had learned that with him, 2 words sometimes carried the weight of a paragraph. She was also, she realized in April, doing something she had not expected to do, which was to stop calculating exits. In the first weeks on the ranch, she had been doing this unconsciously, keeping a running assessment of what she would do if the arrangement collapsed, where they would go, what the $40 could cover, what the sewing machine was worth in current conditions. It was a survival habit built over 3 months of everything going wrong, and it had been useful. But at some point in the winter, she had stopped doing it, and she was not sure when, and when she noticed the absence, she did not know whether to feel relieved or alarmed by her own lack of alarm. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday afternoon in early April when Gideon came into the kitchen and set a letter on the table. She recognized the handwriting. Margaret Holloway. She looked at it without picking it up. It was in the mail from Carrie, Gideon said. He did not ask if she wanted privacy. He also did not leave. He poured a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and stood leaning against the counter with the patience of someone who is not waiting for anything specific but is simply available. She picked up the letter. It was short. Margaret's handwriting, which she knew as well as her own, and which had changed subtly. A slight looseness in the letters, as though whoever was holding the pen was under some pressure. It said, George had received a letter from the commissioner's office. The letter informed him that his statement submitted in support of Harold Briggs's complaint was under review as part of an inquiry into the complaint's validity. George was, and here Margaret's phrasing became careful in the way it always became careful when she was describing her husband in a bad light, not pleased. The Holloways were reconsidering their plans to expand their land holdings to the east of Red Valley, plans which had apparently involved Briggs in some financial capacity that Margaret did not detail. The last paragraph said, I don't expect forgiveness, Evie. I know what I cost you by closing that door. I just wanted you to know that not everything is landing the way Harold planned. Evelyn put the letter down. She thought about Margaret Holloway. She thought about two young women arriving in Red Valley in the same month as new brides, sitting across kitchen tables from each other for 2 decades. She thought about what it cost Margaret to write this letter, with George in the next room not knowing it was being written. She thought about how people were not simple. How the woman who had stood in her own doorway and said, "We can't get involved," was the same woman who had written to warn her about George's statement and who was writing now to say that the walls Harold Briggs had built were developing cracks. People were not simple, and the ones who failed you were rarely only that. Anything important? Gideon said. She looked at him across the kitchen. Briggs's plan is falling apart, she said. At the edges. He nodded slowly, said nothing. The Holloways are connected to it more than I knew, she said. They're losing something too. Good, he said, with the flat directness he had for things he had thought about, and arrived at cleanly. She looked at the letter. It doesn't feel entirely good, she said. He waited. Margaret wrote to warn me about George's statement, she said. She didn't have to do that. And now she's writing again. She was quiet. She's not a bad person. She's a person who let fear make a bad decision and is living with the consequences of it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Are you going to write back to her? She thought about it. I don't know yet, she said. Maybe, when I know what I want to say. He nodded. Put his coffee cup in the basin. He was heading for the door when she said, without planning to say it, Gideon? He stopped. She looked at him. At the man she had married in the county clerk's office on a Wednesday with Ada Crane's flowers and Clara asleep in the wagon. At the man who had warned her about a washed-out road when he had nothing to gain from it. At the man who had sat in Clara's room in the pre-dawn dark, holding a towel over a steam kettle without being asked. Do you regret it? She said. He turned around fully. He looked at her with that unguarded thing she had seen the night in the main room, the expression that wasn't managing anything. No, he said. I don't. It's been complicated, she said. For you. The inspector, the Briggs situation, having 6 children in a house that was built for one person. Houses aren't built for one person, he said. People tell themselves that when they're living alone long enough. It's not accurate. She looked at him. Besides, he said, and there was that near laugh again, brief and unpracticed, the numbers are better. She shook her head. She felt something moving through her that was warm and unguarded and that she did not try to contain. Go do your work, she said. Yes, he said. Same to you. He went out. She picked up the April accounts because the April accounts needed doing, and the work was always real, and real was always the starting point for everything else. Outside, across the yard, she could hear James's voice, lower than it had been in October, not quite a man's voice, but getting there, explaining something to one of the twins who had apparently followed him to the barn. She could not make out the words. She could hear the patience in them. She opened the accounts to the April page. The numbers were good. She ran the column once, checked her arithmetic, ran it again. She made a note at the bottom of the page. East pasture rotation scheduled for first week of May. Review spring cattle numbers with Pete before end of month. She paused, added below that, in her precise handwriting, West fence fully repaired, children healthy, all accounts current. She looked at what she had written, then she turned to the next page and kept going. The letter from Judge Connolly arrived on the second Friday of May, and it was the kind of letter that did not require a second reading to understand, but that you read a second time anyway, because the first time through you were still braced for something to go wrong. Connolly's handwriting was precise and slightly old-fashioned, the kind of handwriting that came from a generation that had been taught penmanship as a moral discipline rather than a practical one. The letter said that the Commissioner's office had completed its review of Harold Briggs's original complaint and the circumstances surrounding it. It said that the complaint had been found to contain deliberate misrepresentations of the conditions at the Cross Ranch property. It said that Briggs had been formally censured by the Commissioner's office and that the censure had been entered into the territorial record. It said that the county magistrate who had been expected to preside over any formal proceeding had recused himself from all cases involving parties connected to Harold Briggs, pending a separate review of 3 prior cases in which his rulings had been questioned. The last paragraph said, "I am writing to inform you of these developments not because any action is required on your part, but because you were the subject of a complaint that was made in bad faith, and you are entitled to know the outcome. The territory takes such matters seriously. I hope you will find the resolution satisfactory." Evelyn read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee going cold beside her. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it beside the coffee cup and sat for a moment in the May morning, which was coming through the south window in the particular golden cool of a Montana spring day before the heat arrived, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was holding. Not triumph. She had learned over the winter to be suspicious of triumph. It was a feeling that assumed you had arrived somewhere, and she had learned the hard way that arrival was mostly an illusion people used to rest before the next part started. What she felt was something steadier than triumph, something that had more to do with ground than height, the feeling of standing on something solid that you had tested and found real. She had spent 7 months being told, in various ways and by various people, that she did not have the standing to be where she was, that her size or her poverty or her widowhood or the number of her children put her outside the category of people who deserved what they had. Harold Briggs had believed this with such certainty that he had committed it to official paper and sent it to the Commissioner's office in Helena. And the Commissioner's office in Helena had looked at what Briggs had sent them, and then had looked at what was actually at the Cross Ranch, and had found that these 2 things did not match, and had said so in the territorial record. The territorial record. She thought about that phrase, about what it meant for something to be entered into the territorial record, that it existed beyond the opinions of any one man, beyond the social agreements of any one town, in the permanent and impartial memory of the institution itself. Harold Briggs had tried to use that institution against her. Instead, it had looked at both of them and decided which one was telling the truth. She picked up her coffee. It was cold, but she drank it anyway, because there was work to be done and the morning was not waiting. She was at the kitchen table when Gideon came in from the barn. He had been up before her, as he usually was. She could tell by the state of the wood stove when she came downstairs that he had already fed it once. He came in with the smell of the barn on him and the morning cold still in his coat, and he looked at the letter on the table and then at her face and apparently read both correctly, because what he said was, "Connolly's letter." Yes. He poured his own coffee, which was also cold by now, and apparently also did not care, because he drank it the same way she had. He read the letter standing at the counter, read it again. "Censured," he said. "Entered into the territorial record," she said. He set the letter down. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at it with the expression he had when he was locating the accurate thing to feel rather than the easy thing. "Is it enough?" he said. She thought about this honestly, because Gideon had earned her honesty and she had learned to give it to him straight, rather than wrapped in whatever was easier to say. "For me," she said, "yes, for the principle of it." She stopped. "I don't know. Briggs didn't go to jail. He withdrew before Marsh's review got far enough to formally charge him with anything. He lost some standing in the territory, but a man like Briggs rebuilds standing. He has the money and connections and the patience to wait out a bad season. He has a territorial censure in his record," Gideon said. Yes, which matters for the next time he tries to do something like this to someone who can't defend themselves the way I could. Gideon looked at her. You're thinking about the woman who can't, he said. Not a question. I'm thinking about what Briggs does when the next widow shows up at his bank, she said. Whether the censure changes his calculation. Probably not, Gideon said. Probably not, she agreed, but possibly, and possibly is more than nothing. He looked at the letter one more time. Then he picked up his hat from the peg by the door. Pete wants to talk about the spring rotation this morning, he said. East pasture numbers are up. He's thinking we can move the north herd earlier than planned. I'll look at the numbers after breakfast, she said. Tell him to bring the count records. He nodded, opened the door. The May morning came in briefly. That golden cool that was already warming at the edges. And then the door closed and he was gone across the yard to the barn, where she could hear, distantly, James's voice and Walt Drummond's answering it in the specific rhythm of their morning work. She sat at the table a moment longer. Then she got up and started breakfast. Because 6 children needed feeding, and the East pasture numbers needed reviewing, and the May accounts were due at the end of the week, and the territory's record of Harold Briggs's censure, while satisfying, did not do any of those things on her behalf. The real reckoning, the one she had not anticipated, came 3 weeks later. It came not in the form of a letter or a legal proceeding, but in the form of a woman on a horse, riding up the road from the gate on a Tuesday afternoon when Evelyn was in the kitchen garden. Properly a kitchen garden now, not the hard frost weeds she had inherited in November, working the soil around the first plantings and thinking about nothing in particular, which was a state she had rarely achieved in the previous 8 months, and which she was trying to learn to value. She saw the horse first, then the woman on it, riding with the upright posture of someone who has spent years on horseback but is not relaxed on this particular ride. Then the face, and she had known before the face was close enough to read, because the posture told her. Margaret Holloway. She straightened, set down her trowel, waited. Margaret pulled up at the edge of the garden and dismounted without being invited, which was the old Margaret, the one who had walked into Evelyn's kitchen in Red Valley 100 times without knocking because the question of invitation had ceased to apply between them long ago. She tied her horse to the post by the garden fence. She was wearing her good wool coat, which meant this was not a casual call. And her face was doing something complicated that Evelyn recognized as the expression Margaret wore when she had decided to do a hard thing and had gotten all the way to the doing of it before allowing herself to feel how hard it was. Evie, she said. Margaret. They looked at each other across the kitchen garden. I won't ask to come in, Margaret said. I don't know that I've earned that. You're standing in my garden in May, Evelyn said. Come in if you want to come in. Something in Margaret's face shifted. A release of something that had been held tight. She came through the garden gate. They sat at the kitchen table, which was where Evelyn had sat with most of the significant conversations of the past 7 months, and which had started to feel like the kind of table that accumulates the weight of important things said at it. She made coffee, fresh, hot, not the cold remnants of a morning that had moved on. And she set a cup in front of Margaret and one in front of herself, and she let Margaret find her way to what she had come to say. It took a moment. Margaret wrapped both hands around the cup the way she always had, which was a habit so particular and unchanged that it produced in Evelyn a sudden and unexpected ache. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, the feeling of time and what it did to the things you took for granted. George doesn't know I'm here, Margaret said. I figured. She stopped, started over. He's very angry about the commissioner's review. He feels that Briggs put him in a position that cost him something, and he's right about that, but he's directing the anger at everyone except Briggs, which is something George has always done. She looked at her coffee. I can't change that about him. I've tried for 23 years. I know, Evelyn said. What I can change, Margaret said, is whether I keep letting his fear be my excuse. She looked up. I told myself, last November, that I was protecting George, that if I got involved, it would cost him something with Briggs, and that the cost wasn't mine to impose. She held Evelyn's gaze. That was not honest. The honest version is that I was afraid and I used George as the reason. Evelyn was quiet. "I'm sorry, Evie," Margaret said. "Not in the way people say it when they want the conversation to be over. I mean it as specifically as I know how to mean it. I had been your friend for 20 years, and when you needed the door to be open, I closed it. And that was wrong, and I'm sorry." The kitchen held the sound of the May morning. The children were outside, she could hear them, the twins arguing about something near the barn, Clara's higher voice cutting across both of them. The sound of all of them alive and accounted for, and in a place where they had enough. She thought about what she wanted to say. She had thought about it before, in the long winter evenings when she'd replayed the conversation on Margaret's porch and felt the sharp, specific hurt of it. She had thought about what she would say if she ever got the chance. In those early versions, what she said was clear and hard and satisfying in the way that things are satisfying when you imagine them alone in the dark, but that rarely feel the same way in daylight with the actual person in front of you. Margaret Holloway was not a villain. That was the thing that the dark and the imagining had simplified. She was a woman who had made a wrong choice under pressure, and who had made two smaller right choices since, writing to warn her, writing to tell her about George's statement, and who was sitting at this table now at some personal cost because she had decided honesty mattered more than comfort. Evelyn knew what that cost felt like. "I know you're sorry," she said. "I believe that." Margaret waited. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt," Evelyn said. "Because it did. It hurt differently than Briggs, because Briggs was never my friend. You were." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "But I also know—" She paused, finding the right shape for what she was trying to say, which was true and complicated and did not have a clean edge. "I know that people who fail you are not always only that. You wrote to warn me. That was not nothing. That was you deciding, when it mattered, to be honest even when it cost you something." Margaret looked at the table. "I don't know exactly what we are now," Evelyn said. "I'm not sure we can go straight back to what we were, because what we were was built on a kind of trust that has to be rebuilt. And rebuilding takes time." She looked at her coffee. "But I'm not interested in holding it forever either. That's a weight I don't want to carry." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "That's more than I deserve," she said. "Maybe," Evelyn said, "but it's what's true." They sat together for a while, not filling the silence with words that weren't needed, which was something they had been able to do once and were apparently still able to do, and which was its own kind of information about what remained between them. When Margaret left, Evelyn stood at the kitchen door and watched her ride down to the gate, and she felt something settle in her that had been slightly unsettled since November. Not fully resolved, not entirely at peace, but positioned somewhere more workable than before. The kind of position from which things could, given time and honesty on both sides, move forward. She went back to the kitchen garden. She was still working the soil when James appeared at the garden gate. He was 15 now. He had grown another inch since March, and there was something in his face that had changed in the way faces change when the person inside them is in the process of becoming someone with a specific shape. Not just his father's stubbornness, though that was there, but something of his own that was still clarifying. He had his father's watch in his pocket still, every day, which she knew because she had done the laundry for 8 months and the watch was always there, and she had never said anything about it because there was nothing that needed saying. He looked at the road where Margaret Holloway had gone. "Was that Mrs. Holloway?" he said. "Yes." "What did she want?" "To apologize," Evelyn said. He thought about this for a moment. "Are you going to forgive her?" She looked at her son. At the question, which was not a simple question, even though it was asked simply, which was characteristic of him. He had a way of landing on the center of things without apparent effort. "I'm working on it," she said. "That's the honest answer." He nodded slowly, leaned against the gatepost. "Gideon says forgiving people isn't for their benefit," he said. "He says it's for yours. So you don't have to spend energy on being angry at them when you could be spending it on something worth more." She looked at him. "When did he say that?" "Last week. We were fixing the north fence." He paused. He wasn't talking about Mrs. Holloway. He was talking about the man who left him with all the debt when the ranch was new, his old partner. He looked at the ground. He said he was angry at the man for about 4 years, and then he realized the man was probably in some card game in Denver, not thinking about him at all, and the only person carrying the anger was him. She was quiet. "He said he let it go," James said. Not because the man deserved it, because he had a ranch to run. She looked at the soil in the garden, the dark Montana earth that had spent the winter frozen and was now soft enough to work with her hands. She thought about carrying things, about what you chose to carry and what you chose to set down, and the difference between the two and how rarely that difference was about whether the weight was deserved. "That's good sense," she said. "Yes," James said. "He's got good sense. Mostly." The corner of his mouth moved in the particular way that reminded her, still, of Thomas. Not the same face, but a similar internal weather. "He's wrong about the east pasture rotation timing. I've been watching that drainage situation for 6 weeks, and I think he's moving the herd 3 days too early." "Have you told him that?" "I'm going to tonight." She looked at her son. "Tell him with the data," she said, "not just the opinion." "I know, Mama." He pushed off the gatepost. "I'm 15, not 12. He went back toward the barn. She watched him go and felt the complicated fullness of it, the satisfaction and the sorrow and the pride and the loss and the recognition that these things did not separate neatly into categories, but simply lived together in the same space, which was the truth about most of what mattered. The dinner that evening was the kind of dinner that the cross table had settled into over months. Not ceremonious, not effortful, just people who had learned each other's habits sitting around a table and eating. Pete had eaten with them 3 times a week since February, which had started as a practical arrangement during a cold snap, when walking back to the bunkhouse in the dark seemed unreasonable, and which had quietly become something else. Billy Reck ate with them on Sundays. Walt came when he felt like it, which was irregular but not infrequent. James brought up the east pasture rotation during the second half of the meal, which Evelyn noted with some satisfaction was exactly the right timing. Not immediately, while people were still settling in, but not so late that the conversation felt ambushed. He laid out his observation of the drainage patterns over 6 weeks, the soil moisture he had checked by hand in 3 locations across the pasture, and his estimate of the risk to the herd's hooves if they moved 3 days early into ground that hadn't fully firmed. Gideon listened without interrupting, which was his practice with James in a way it wasn't always with Pete, and which Evelyn noticed and had noted before. He asked 2 questions, about the moisture check locations and about whether James had compared his observations to the drainage patterns from last spring. James had compared them. He had asked Walt, who remembered, and Walt confirmed the numbers. Pete said, "The boy's right." Everyone looked at Pete. "I've been wondering the same thing," Pete said, without particular drama. "Didn't say it because I thought we'd committed to the schedule." Gideon looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at James. 3 days. 3 days, James said. "All right." James did not visibly gloat, which was, Evelyn thought, probably the most mature thing he had done in 15 years. After dinner, after the dishes, after the children had sorted themselves upstairs and Pete had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Walt had finished his coffee and gone out into the May evening, Evelyn and Gideon sat on the porch. This had become a habit in April, when the evenings finally turned warm enough to sit outside. They did not always talk. Sometimes they sat with the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who had run out of the need to fill space with words, which was a thing she had not expected to have with him, and which had arrived without announcement somewhere in the middle of winter. Tonight she told him about Margaret Holloway. He listened. He was leaning back in the chair with his long legs stretched out and his coffee balanced on his knee, and he listened the way he listened, fully, without preparing his response while she was still talking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel about it?" he said. "I told her I'm working on forgiving her," Evelyn said. "That's still true." "That's fair." "James told me what you said," she said, "about your old partner, about carrying the anger." He glanced at her. "When did that come up?" "Fence repair, apparently." He was quiet. I didn't realize he was listening that carefully. "He listens to everything," she said. "He always has. He's quieter about it than Daniel, so people don't notice, but he absorbs everything that gets said around him and he holds on to it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He told me about Thomas's watch," he said, "last week." She looked at him. "He told you?" "He said he carries it because it reminds him that his father worked hard for things that mattered, and that the working was what mattered, not whether you got to finish. He paused. He said he used to be angry about not getting to finish things his father started. He said he's less angry now. She looked at the May evening. At the pasture in the long last light, the cattle moving slowly along the fence line, the pine brake on the north side dark and dense. At the property that had been a place to survive and had become, without her planning it or even noticing it happening, a place she thought of as home. "He's a good boy," she said. "He's becoming a good man," Gideon said. She looked at him. He was looking at the pasture with the expression she associated with his honest thinking. Not performed, not managing anything, just looking at something true and locating it correctly. "I owe you something," she said. He looked at her then. "Not in a debt way," she said. "I owe you the truth about something I've been thinking about and haven't said." "All right," he said. "When you offered the arrangement, the marriage, I told you I wasn't doing it because of Briggs. I told you the answer wasn't only strategy for me either." "I remember," he said. "What I didn't tell you," she said, "was what the other part was. I said it wasn't only strategy, but I didn't name the other thing." He waited. "The other thing," she said carefully, not because she was being evasive, but because she wanted it to be accurate, was that I had spent 5 months watching you do every difficult thing with the same quality of attention. And I had started to understand that a person who pays that kind of attention to things, to work, to animals, to a 14-year-old boy who needs someone to explain things to him like he's someone who should know them, that kind of person is rare. She looked at the evening. I had been lonely for longer than I let myself know, not because Thomas was gone, though that was part of it, but a particular kind of lonely, the kind where you're capable of things and you don't have anyone around you who can see that clearly, who looks at you and sees the actual capacity instead of the outline. She stopped. He was very still. "You looked at me on that road," she said, "like you were calculating what I could do, not what I looked like or what I'd lost or what category of person the territory had decided I was. And that," she paused, "that was the other part." The evening held everything still for a moment. Then Gideon Cross set his coffee cup on the porch railing and turned in his chair to look at her directly, with the unguarded quality she had first seen in the near pasture in January, and that she had been watching develop and deepen over 5 months of ordinary difficult days. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "Longer than was good for me, probably, though I would have argued against that at the time. And I had—" He stopped, selected his words with the care he gave to things that mattered. "I had told myself a story about what I needed, which was essentially that I didn't need anything beyond the ranch and the work. And I believed it because it was easier to believe than the alternative, which was that I had gotten very good at not needing things because needing things had cost me badly once, and I didn't want to be in that position again." She said nothing. "The morning I came around that bend," he said, "and I saw you on that wagon, I wasn't thinking any of what I just said. I was thinking about the road conditions and about getting to Cary before noon. And then I looked at you and I thought, that woman is going to drive through whatever's in front of her." He paused. "And I couldn't leave that alone." She looked at him. "Not because you needed help," he said, "because I wanted to see where you were going." The May evening was doing what May evenings did, gradually giving up its light from the western edge while the eastern sky held on to the last of its blue. The cattle were settling. The pine brake was going dark. In the house behind them, she could hear Clara's voice, too high and too fast for this time of night, which meant someone was going to have to go in and settle her in the next 10 minutes. But not yet. "I want to tell you something too," she said. "All right." "I'm not easy," she said. "I'm aware of that. I have opinions about everything and I keep records of all of them, and I will rearrange your kitchen shelves for efficiency without asking first and tell you you're wrong about pasture rotation timing through our 15-year-old son." He looked at her with that thing that was almost a laugh. "I know that," he said. "I also," she said, "intend to stay. Not because I don't have other options, not because this is the best I could find, because this is where I want to be." She met his eyes. "I wanted to say that plainly so you knew it." He was quiet for a long moment. "Good," he said. Then Clara called from upstairs. Not in distress, just in the relentless way she called when she was supposed to be asleep and had thought of something too important to wait for morning. And the moment released itself into the ordinary evening. Gideon Cross stood up and went inside to deal with Clara. Evelyn sat on the porch for a few more minutes, watching the last of the light go out of the sky over the pasture, and she felt the shape of the life she was in. Its weight and its warmth and its particular combination of difficult and good, which was the only combination she had ever found that was worth taking seriously. There is a thing that happens to people who have been told they are too much for long enough. They begin to move through the world taking up less space than they need. Not because they are humble, but because they are tired of the cost of existing at full size. They make themselves smaller and quieter, and they put away the parts of themselves that other people find inconvenient. And they do this so gradually and for so long that they start to believe the smaller version is the real one. Evelyn Ward had been doing this for years before she ended up on that road out of Red Valley with $40 and a sewing machine and 6 children. She had not known she was doing it. That was the particular insidiousness of the thing. It didn't feel like retreat. It felt like adaptation. It felt like the reasonable management of a world that had its opinions about what you were allowed to be. What she had found, in 7 months on this ranch, was something she had not been looking for because she had not known it was missing. She had found the experience of being seen at full size by people who were not diminished by what they saw. Pete Calloway, who had brought her the monthly cost comparisons without being asked. Walt Drummond, who reported on James's work with the meticulous care of someone who understood that information was respect. Ada Crane, who had said, "I'll say what I've observed with the matter-of-fact weight of a woman who had been telling the truth for 30 years and did not intend to stop. Gideon Cross, who had handed her a ledger. And her children, who had never seen the smaller version in the first place, because children tend to see the actual size of their parents, regardless of what the parents are performing for everyone else. They had known all along what she was capable of. They had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The summer came with its work and its heat and its specific rhythms. The cattle moving, the garden producing, the accounts running in the black for the 3rd consecutive quarter. A fact that Pete noted with what passed, for Pete, as open pride when he brought her the numbers. Billy Reck fell briefly and emphatically in love with a girl from Cary named Josephine who worked at the dry goods store. And the situation was conducted with the helpless transparency of a 22-year-old who had not yet learned to be strategic about his feelings, which Evelyn found both touching and occasionally inconvenient when it affected his work schedule. She said nothing about the feelings and addressed the work schedule directly, which seemed to her the appropriate division of involvement. James turned 15 in July, and Gideon gave him a horse. Not Clara's question from that first dinner, not Slate, who was Gideon's and always would be, but a young bay mare from the spring that James had been working with since April, and that had, over 3 months, become something like his in everything but the legal fact of ownership. Gideon made it the legal fact on James's birthday, with the same straightforward lack of ceremony with which he did most things, handing James the papers and saying, "She was already yours. This just makes it accurate." James took the papers and looked at them and did not say anything for a moment, which was how he handled things that were too large for immediate words. Then he said, "Thank you." Gideon nodded. "Don't thank me. Raise her right." Daniel, who was 13 and processing things at the rate of a boy who processed everything at twice the speed he could handle, said, "When do I get a horse?" "When you stop leaving the barn door open," Gideon said. This produced a silence that was somehow deeply satisfying to everyone present except Daniel. Ruth, who was 11 and had spent the winter and spring reading everything in the house that had words in it, asked Gideon in August whether she could write to a school in Helena that offered correspondence courses in mathematics and natural science. She had found a reference to it in one of the almanacs on the shelf and had researched it with the thoroughness she brought to everything she decided to care about. Gideon read the almanac page she brought him, asked her 2 questions about what she hoped to learn and why, listened to her answers with the attention he gave to things he was genuinely considering. "Write the letter," he said. "Let's see what they say." Ruth wrote the letter that afternoon with a precision that suggested she had been composing it in her head for several weeks and was simply transcribing. The school wrote back in 3 weeks. The cost of the correspondence course was more than Evelyn had anticipated, but less than she had feared, and she and Gideon discussed it the way they discussed everything financial, with the accounts open and the reasoning stated plainly, and agreed it was the right expenditure because a mind like Ruth's left undeveloped was its own kind of waste. Ruth started the course in September. She completed the first set of exercises in half the expected time and wrote to the school asking whether she could move at her own pace rather than the course's pace. The school said yes. Evelyn noted all of this in the accounts under a line she had started in August. Children, investment. She was aware this was not a standard accounting category. She did not care. In October, a year and 2 days after Thomas Ward had gone out to check the north fence line and not come back, she went to the small rise on the east edge of the property that had the widest view of the valley. Not because Gideon had taken her there, or because it was a significant place in any history other than her own, but because she had found it in February during a walk she'd taken when she needed to be outside and away from the house. And she had sat there for an hour watching the valley below the snow. And she had decided it was hers in the way that certain places become yours, not because you own them, but because you paid attention to them. She sat there now in the October afternoon, which was the color October gets in Montana. Not quite autumn anywhere else, something harder and more serious. The gold of it already edged with the knowledge of what was coming. She thought about Thomas. She did this more honestly now than she had been able to do in the first months after he died, when grief had a way of simplifying the dead into only their best parts, which was understandable but not entirely fair to the complexity of the person who had actually existed. Thomas Ward had been a good man and a difficult man, and a man who loved her without always knowing how to show it, and who had kept debts from her that she should have known about, and who had added the porch because she mentioned the sunsets once and never said a word about it, just built it, which was its own kind of language. She missed him. That was still true, and she thought it would always be true, not in the acute way of the early months, but in the settled way of something that had become part of the permanent landscape of who she was. She also knew, sitting on the rise in October with the valley spread out below her, that she was not living in his absence anymore. She was living in her own life. That was not a betrayal of him. That was, she thought, the thing he would have wanted most. For her to stop standing at the edge of town with her hat in her hands and start driving the wagon. She had driven the wagon. She was still driving it. There is something that people who have survived the particular experience of being publicly discarded tend to understand that other people sometimes don't, which is this: the world does not correct itself automatically. It does not look at the evidence and revise its opinions and come back to apologize for the conclusions it rushed to. It continues being the world with all its speed and noise and social machinery, and if you wait for it to notice it was wrong about you, you will wait a long time in a cold place. What you can do, the only thing, really, that is genuinely in your hands, is build something true enough and solid enough that the world eventually has to reckon with it, whether it wants to or not. Not to prove anything, not to make anyone feel bad about what they said, but because the building itself is what matters. And because a person who stops building when the world gets hostile has let the hostility decide something that was never the hostility's decision to make. Evelyn Ward had built something. She had built it out of ledger books and feed supply contracts and reglazed windows and a kitchen garden and a system for the dry goods shelves and 6 children in a clean house with enough food and Ruth's mathematics correspondence and James's horse and Daniel's eventual, grudging, habit of closing the barn door and the twins who still ran everywhere and Clara, who at 5 had recently informed Gideon with great seriousness that his name was a good name for someone who lived in a gray house, which she apparently found logical, and he had listened to this observation with the expression he had when he found something unexpectedly worth thinking about. She had built it out of the particular doggedness of a woman who had been told she was too much, and had decided at some point on a road in November that too much was not a flaw but a quantity, and that the question was not whether to reduce it, but where to put it. She had put it here. She heard his boots on the dry grass before she heard him, because she had learned to hear Gideon Cross coming across open ground, the same way she had come to know the sound of the house settling in the cold, and the sound of the cattle when something was wrong, and the sound of the May morning through the south window when everything was right. He sat down beside her on the rise, not close enough to crowd, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the October air. He looked at the valley. Pete says the North herd count is up 14% over last year, he said. I know, she said. I ran the numbers this morning. James was right about the pasture rotation. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Clara told me at breakfast that I need to smile more because I have a nice face. She turned to look at him. He had, she noticed, a slight curve to his mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity. She's not wrong, Evelyn said. He looked at the valley. Then he looked at her with the full unguarded quality that she had watched develop over a year from something brief and rare into something she could count on finding when she looked. All right, Year, he said. She thought about Marcia's letter and Connolly's letter and Harold Briggs's withdrawal and Margaret Holloway at the kitchen table and James's horse and Ruth's mathematics and the East pasture numbers and Clara's opinion of Gideon's name and the October valley below them going gold in the afternoon light. Yes, she said. All right, Year. They sat on the rise together while the light moved across the valley the way light does in October, slowly, and then all at once the gold pulling back toward the west and leaving behind it something cleaner and cooler and real. Below them the ranch went about its business. The cattle moved. The horses stood at the fence in the near pasture. Smoke was beginning to come from the kitchen chimney, which meant one of the children had gotten to the stove first, which was either Ruth being responsible or Daniel trying to make something inadvisable, and she would know which in about 10 minutes when she got back down there. She was not in a hurry. She was here, on this rise, in this October, in this life that she had not planned and had not seen coming, and that was hers in every way that mattered. Not because someone had given it to her, but because she had driven a wagon through everything that tried to stop her, and she had been stubborn enough and tired enough and determined enough to keep driving until she found the place where it was worth stopping. That was the whole of it, really. That was the story. Not that the world had been fair to her, because it hadn't. Not that the people who had wronged her had been fully brought to account, because they mostly hadn't. Not in the clean and final way that made a satisfying ending. Harold Briggs was still in Red Valley. He was a smaller man with a narrower reach, but he was there. George Holloway was still angry at Briggs for the wrong reasons. The territory was still what it was, hard and slow to revise its opinions, incapable of deciding what a woman was worth before she had opened her mouth. But Evelyn Cross was here. Her children were here. This ranch was here, and it was hers as much as it was Gideon's, not in the legal language of the deed, but in the language of everything she had put into it and everything it had given back. Some things you don't get to finish. Some things you do. She got up from the rise and walked back down the hill toward the house, toward the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney and the sound of whoever was in there doing something she would either approve of or correct, toward the life that was waiting for her, the way lives wait, indifferently, without regard for whether you were ready, full of the next thing before you had finished the last one. She walked down the hill and went inside. The door closed behind her. The October evening settled over the valley, and the ranch kept going, the way ranches do, the way anything does that has been built by people who decided that what they were building was worth the building. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.